Good evening and welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for October 14th, 2019. And for those who are watching, you're probably watching on YouTube because we are not on live this evening. There is some work going on in the boardroom, so we are in the collaborative room. And this will be shown, it'll be on the day after the meeting, and you'll be able to see it at that point in time. So if you're tuning in to see discussion, you're going to see more tonight on these items that are before the board. They've probably been to the brought up to the board at least on one occasion, perhaps more in certain circumstances. But tonight is when we delve into a little deeper dive into the material that we have. So you'll hear a little more discussion, probably more questions, a little more explanation on the items. So stay tuned. So we will start with item 1, audience communication. The other thing you'll notice is we have laptops, which is new to us. We are in the process of transitioning, hopefully, to paperless. So bear with us. This is new to us, and we're getting our feet wet on this. So there may be a little bit of angst going on, but not too much. So our first item is item 1, audience communication. I do not have any blue slips. No one rushing up to talk to us, so that'll take us to item 2, committee of the whole. I do not have anything. Mrs. Oaquist, do you have anything to add?
We do not.
Thank you. That'll take us to item 3, our curriculum committee, and I'll turn it over to Mrs. Jarvis.
Thank you. Tonight we'll be looking at the textbook adoption update with Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I wanted to share with you just an update as we are entering our 3rd year of textbook adoptions utilizing Wayne County Enhancement Millage monies. You have a memo in your packet on your computer or hard copy that just kind of summarizes the past 3 years worth of textbook adoptions. I'm going to just walk through them quickly. So during the 2017-18 school year, we've adopted all of our foreign language level 1 books. Geometry, Algebra 2, and Statistics were adopted. Our ELA 9th and 10th grade adoption committee started during the 17-18 school year, but did not complete its work until the 18-19 school year. Our middle school social studies, both for 7th and 8th grade, we adopted new textbooks. So that's the summary of 17-18, and so we were under budget for what we had allocated, a total of $871,187. Last year, during the 2018-19 school year, we started many textbook reviews but have not completed all of them. So I'm going to start with the ones that did get completed. So middle school science did get completed for grades 6 through 8. We adopted Amplified. We adopted guided reading materials for elementary. We started looking at electronic guided reading materials level text and chose instead small guided reading books to update our classroom materials for using with our students. We also adopted foreign language level 2, so French, German, and Spanish level 2 books, pre-algebra, and then we looked at calculus materials, but at this point we only had 1 course of calculus running and did not see a large difference between the calculus books that are out there today to what we currently use, so we, the committee chose not to get a new textbook for that. We started last year our social studies elementary group, and they are continuing their work this year, so we'll look forward to hearing from them later in this school year. And lastly, we added some STEM electives through Project Lead the Way last year. So again, we were under budget for our 2nd year, but you know, those years have been flexible where we've moved things to the 2nd year. We want to make sure we're making the right decision. And so if we need to go to a 2nd year for any particular grade level or content area, we want to do that. So the last, where we're at for this year, so currently we are looking at 11th and 12th grade ELA materials. They're is 2 committees that are currently reviewing the curriculum and looking at materials for that. We are also, and we have not started, a middle school math textbook adoption for 6th, 7th, and 8th. We found last year during our pre-algebra committee that was looking at textbooks that our middle school math program is not aligned to the Common Core like it was stated when we adopted it. So since we adopted that program, and we adopted it in 2014, Ed Reports has become an unbiased source of rating textbook materials and comparing it to the Common Core. And last year they came out with a rating for our middle school materials, and it was red, so that's the least aligned to the Common Core. And so we will be starting a textbook committee looking at that this year. We've met with Mr. Miga. He has some plans to move forward with levels 3, 4, and 5 for world languages. And then we have not started a humanities, but we are looking at what our humanities courses needs, doing a review of what the standards are and what their needs would be. Our psychology and sociology courses have already started looking at reviewing their curriculum and aligning it to the standards. And then as the fall gets closer to the winter, we'll begin biology, advanced physics, and physics. So that is where we're at for this year, and looking forward into the future, utilizing Wayne County Enhancement Village monies, we'd like to look at elementary ELA and science and middle school ELA. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mrs. O'Quist.
Thank you. Mrs. O'Brien, you mentioned, and I know we've shared this with the board before, but it may be a good opportunity to just share, if we've moved something into the following year, what might cause us to delay an adoption? So where we would have recommended to the board that this particular item would be covered in the 1920 school year, and perhaps it doesn't go forward that year, what might cause that item to move on to a following year?
So a really good example is our middle school science materials that we just adopted. So that committee actually started in 17-18, and they took over a year and a half to make their decision as to what's the best program. So first they had to look at the new next generation science standards. So our science standards were not aligned in our courses. So they did a lot of curriculum review and standard review in order to look at materials before they even began that work. So there's some visioning work to do, there's some standards work to do, and then they look at materials. And that middle school program or committee actually piloted 3 different science programs in order to choose Amplify. So hands down, it was the one that students liked the best. It's the one that teachers liked the best. But to get to that, they had 2 others that were close, so that they wanted to teach all 3 of them and pilot them in their classrooms. So in order to give that good, deep look at something, they wanted to take their time.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Mrs. Frank?
I know that we did 9th and 10th grade ELA and passed that. So as they look at 11th and 12th, do they review that, how that's worked before we just go on with that? Or do they try and connect the 2, or does it depend on how well it's worked in the classrooms?
So always having some consistency is good. But in high school, 11th grader is different than a 9th grader. So there's pros and cons to both of those. The committee of 11th and 12th grade teachers that are on it have gone and done some training with the materials that our 9th and 10th grade teachers are using, so they understand what kids are getting before they come to 11th and 12th grade. And so that way then they have that foundation of what the focuses are at 9th and 10th in order to make a decision at 11th and 12th.
Okay. So it's still starting from the beginning?
Yep, you
taking
still
that
have to
in-
do the visioning
Yeah.
work and the standards work and all of that. Yep, but they do take into consideration where kids are coming.
Right.
Mrs. Burton?
I've got a couple of questions on the 2018-19 year. For middle school science and K-6 Library of Electronic Texts, we went over our budget there. However, I do see we're under our budget overall from the previous year and that 18-19 school year. Was that a decision under you, and in light of the fact that we had other monies that were not being spent still in the curriculum committee, but in other areas, that we could shift to those two?
So we're trying very hard to be fiscally responsible with the monies that we've been given by Wayne County Enhancement. So we worked with Mrs. Smith when we haven't spent what was budgeted the
Right.
previous year, and we know that group's moving, so she's helped make sure, so that Amplify Science, to make sure we had budgeted in the
Right.
previous year, it's there in that next year. So it has given us a little bit of a cushion to go over in a couple areas, and then, other ones. And our allocated targets were based on previous year's amounts of money. So, some of them we were under. There was less courses across the district, so we didn't need to purchase as many materials. And some were larger than expected. Spanish level 2 was much higher than the other two languages. So, just trying to make sure that when we've made a decision, we get everyone what they need.
Okay.
I also think with regard to literacy footprints, that was not initially intended to be in that category. So literacy footprints were the guided reading
Uh-huh.
material kits that were piloted the year prior and really a high priority need for our elementary teachers. And so it was, I believe, put under the category of K-6 Library of Electronic Text.
We started with looking at an electronic, a bank of electronic text that kids could be pulling from. But instead, through looking at the materials were out there, our book rooms, our guided reading books, we haven't replaced them, buildings have purchased them. And so instead, that elementary committee really suggested, how about we start there and give every teacher new guided reading books instead of an electronic library of things to choose from. And one of the reasons we really liked the footprints is because they came with a specific lesson plan for every book, so a teacher didn't have to do that work.
Okay, so, and that kind of leads me to my next question is, what exactly comprises that K-6 Library of Electronic Arts, or electronic text rather? And it looks like that literacy footprints is the biggest chunk of that, of the monies that were spent there.
I left the title that we originally started with on the left of that chart, but it isn't electronics, it is little books. So we
Okay.
started with that in mind, knowing we were going to Chromebooks and knowing that we wanted to give kids that opportunity to read. But instead, what we chose is to give teachers that foundational guided reading program instead. So we
Okay.
didn't purchase electronic text.
Maybe
Okay.
what we could do as we continue to update this is just change the title of that. I think the title of that is a bit
Yep.
misleading, and so maybe to change that to K-6 resources of electronic and print
Yep.
texts for guided reading.
And we are doing, just for the benefit of the public, we are doing an awful lot with the Chromebooks
We
already.
are.
It's not like we're not utilizing them. We are, just
Correct.
this specific budget that is being utilized in a different manner.
Correct.
Okay. And also, this board has made this comment many times, but I'll say it again. Thank you so much to the citizens of Wayne County for passing the Wayne County Enhancement Millage. That allows us to update so many of these materials that really we just had to put on hold during the recession when every school district in the state of Michigan was just going down to bare bones to do what was necessary to get by and get through that period. But thank you so much to our voters, because this is one enormous hands-on example of where that money is being spent for our kids.
Yes,
So thank
you're
you.
very lucky. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments for Mrs. O'Brien? Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you.
And that completes the curriculum committee.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. That will then take us to our Finance Committee and Mrs. Bonnefield.
Thank you, President Johnson. Mrs. Smith is gonna help us out, with item A, which is our budget amendment number 1. Are they coming around? There's coming around. Oh, here, Andrea, we need one more.
Sure.
Good evening, everyone. As it's become the custom, I've come bearing updates of financial news Typically in October, we take this opportunity to report out on our 18-19 year-to-date expenditures and revenue compared to where we had thought we would be. And we also take the opportunity to look at new information that's become available since we had to adopt our budget in June, and then present that to the board. In addition to the normal update we do, I'm proposing bringing a formal amendment that the board will vote on at the regular meeting in October. So I brought that packet with us to go over tonight. I know you are all aware, we were required to adopt a proposed budget in June, before we started our fiscal year, and we did not have a budget in place from the state of Michigan. They've just approved that within the last couple weeks, so we definitely have some new information to go over. Thankfully, it's good news. So I'll start on the revenue side for the general fund. So within the last couple weeks, we've heard a few different, or we have a few different items that have come up. The first is our foundation allowance. We budgeted for a foundation allowance increase of $105 per student. We consulted with other districts in the area and found that that was kind of the average that everybody was using. At that rate, that would help offset our declining enrollment. So our foundation allowance, we were assuming, was going to stay flat for the 19-20 school year. Thankfully, the foundation allowance was approved at $120 per pupil, and our decline in enrollment wasn't as significant as we thought. We had budgeted for 190 student loss, and we are projecting now 100 to 110. So the net effect of those two things is a positive swing in the foundation allowance of $769,000. We also learned, as the state approved their budgets, that they were approving a 2% increase in the reimbursement of our special ed costs. So the district incurs about $10 million of special ed related costs in our general fund that are not reimbursed by the state. They currently reimburse 28%, and that amount will be going up to 30% in 19-20. So for our general fund, that works out to $350,000 more than what we had included in the proposed budget. Another item of note was the Wayne County Enhancement Millage. We had consulted with Wayne Risa in May, June to find out what they were anticipating as far as property tax value increases, and based on that information, they were projecting about 2%. We budgeted for what we thought would be about $5.2 million to our district. And the taxable values were updated in July, and the increase was larger than Wayne County had anticipated. So they just updated the superintendents with the new property tax values, and what that means for our district is an additional $400,000 worth of Wayne County enhancement millage for 19-20. So great news, all coming to us within the last couple of weeks. They account for $1.5 million increase in revenue for 19-20. We've also, in this amendment, updated the beginning fund balance, and I'll mention, because of where our ending fund balance was in 18-19, we do have a shift in the proceeds from the sale of property that was once included in the general fund as another financing source, but now that our fund balance is in line with the MSBO recommended 15 to 20%, during this amendment, I'm proposing moving that to the capital projects fund as outlined in our board policy, because that's a one-time revenue. We want to use that for one-time expenditures such as capital projects. So net, that all works out to a positive of $944,000 to the good in our general fund. Also, the beginning fund balance has been updated. We thought we would be starting the year with $27.1 million, and we're starting with $30.9 million. I do want to make note, part of that fund balance is committed, and that was about $1.5 million for purchases that were approved by the board in 18-19 that are going to be received and paid for in the 19-20 school year. So as we look at the next page on the expenditure side, we'll see that that $1.5 million is included on the expenditures. We also had, as of June 30th, assigned fund balance of just over $1.1 million, and that was planned use of our fund balance to cover our 19-20 expenditures in excess of the 19-20 revenues we anticipated collecting. So that was a lot of information. I'll stop there. Any questions on the general fund revenue at this point? Okay, I'll move on to the next page, which is our general fund expenditures. So in light of this positive news, we began discussions with the board last week at our study session on what were some additions, some things that we could put in place in the 1920 school year to help support our students and our staff. And so we had a lot of discussion on what that might look like, wanting to be responsible stewards of the funds, but we also felt like we do have an opportunity to put some things into place. We didn't have to wait till next year for everything. So some of the ideas that we discussed and have been included in this budget are bumps, one-time bumps to the teaching allocations across the district. That's something we've heard. Teaching supply, thank you. Teaching supply allocations across the district. We've heard that there are some needs in our buildings that if they had some additional funds, they'd be able to purchase. So having direct impact on our students. We also talked about putting some early elementary support in place in the form of like a support like paraprofessional, edu-staff support, and that could be used at the lower levels. We also talked about some secondary balancing for second semester to allow some flexibility in the scheduling and offer some additional opportunities for our students. And we also talked about putting in some social emotional supports, including mental health for our students, and working with our community partners to see what that might look like to address some needs that have become very apparent to us. Also, we talked about helping with some of the increased insurance costs that are being felt by our employees. I'm sure the board feels that, the community feels that. That's something that's impacting so many of us, and because we're in the position to do so, we did want to look at our contributions to the employees' health insurance costs. So this First Amendment includes these additional expenditures that were discussed at length last year. You can see kind of spread across the different funds. I do want to make note, unlike other formal board budget amendments, these will probably fluctuate between the functions. This was doing a very high level kind of analysis of where to spend the money or where to apply this additional expenditures. During our next amendment, I'll go through all 3,500 budget line items and make sure that it's accounted for in the correct spot. But I feel good that we've made a very good, we've made some good decisions for this one. So. Again, I'll pause to see if anybody has any questions on the general fund expenditures.
So I'll just hop in. So last week we spent quite a bit of time on this topic, I think a couple of hours. And since that time, we've had an opportunity to meet with our leadership at different levels. So all of our elementary principals, representatives from each of our secondary schools and their administration team, as well as our student services leadership team. And they were really helpful in helping us hone some of those recommendations, identifying to either confirm that some of the things that our cabinet team had identified as some of the greatest needs for our students and our schools in some of those additional support pieces that we had talked about are the areas of greatest need, and then also provided some additional suggestions for consideration. So we're going to be finalizing those within the next couple of days, certainly within that budget allocation that you had that we had discussed with you last week, and then in your packet you'll have a more detailed update of what those are. So we'll stay within that budget allocation that we had discussed, but just making some tweaks based on our leadership's feedback, who are doing that day-to-day work in the schools, to say, boy, what are some instructional material needs that are greatest right now? Where are some of those additional supports that would be able to provide some of those really necessary items for student learning and teacher instruction?
I'm happy to report too, even with these additional expenditures we're proposing, that the projected ending fund balance for 1920 still is within the MSBO recommended amount, 17.4%. So it's great that we can use these resources to help our students and yet still maintain that financial stability that we're looking for in the district.
Mrs. Oakwith,
Yes.
I would like to direct a question to you.
Sure.
I know after all of these years with the recession and stuff, this really kind of looks like there are lots of bells and whistles. And can you just talk a little bit about
Sure.
how we are still behind where we used to be, and that this isn't going over the top icing on the cake, that this is slowly creeping back to give us the services that we used to be able to provide our students before the recession. And just to talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. So you brought up a really good point, Mrs. Bonifield, and something that I know we spent a lot of time on as a group last week talking about, and I think the phrase that was used is the revenue is more than we had planned, but not more than we need. The need still exists for us to be strong advocates for public education to be funded appropriately in our state, and we will continue that advocacy on a regular basis as we do now. It is important to note that because some of these additional dollars have come into the district this year, that we felt it important to utilize as many of those resources as possible on the students in front of us at this point in time, and to take a look at what the schools need. One of the things we realized in our conversations with our leadership teams is how much we've been in the mindset of really very limited scope, especially with regard to instructional supplies, resources, time bank, things like that. And we really have been in the mode of looking to outside resources, whether that's grants or PTAs and other funding for really some of our most basic supplies. And so you're absolutely right. We are not talking about the chandelier items. We are still talking about the basic need items for our classrooms and for our schools. But what this does allow us to do is say, okay, what are some of those needs that have been put aside or second or third tier for a few years, and where can we begin to put some additional, for instance, books into each of our classroom libraries. So to have dollars for each of our schools, K-6, to be able to purchase additional books for classroom libraries. That's just one small example. But those are things that we've had to look at outside resources because we haven't had those additional dollars. So I think one of the things that this allows us to do is, one, to take a look this year to say what are those things that we can put in place even though the school year is already underway, and then begin to plan effectively. As you know, we begin the budgeting process in February to bring you a budget in June. And so we will have a chance to take some of that feedback from our leadership and some of the things that we shared with you last week that may not be immediate installation items, but things we want to consider as we move forward. But always keeping a close eye on, you know, what revenue is legacy revenue versus one-time revenue, and to be sure that our expenditures match that source.
Mrs. Burton?
Mrs. Oquist, going back to our meeting, our study session last week, one example of this is that we used to have kindergarten parapros in every kindergarten full-time, all day, every day.
Yes.
So we had 2 adult sets of hands with every 20 to 25 kindergartners, which still is quite a juggle, I think. We did have to pull all of our parapros out, and we are in the process right now. We have some for the first handful of days of school, and we're looking at this point, when we're talking about early elementary parapros, we're looking at putting some flexible parapro days back into the lower elementary grades at this point. Can you give us any thoughts that may have either been confirmed since our last meeting or may have changed since the last meeting when you go and talk to our administration?
Yes, so as what we did do, and we've done for the past, I don't know, I believe since we've gone to full day kindergarten, we've put some support in place for each kindergarten classroom for the first 2 to 3 weeks of the school year, really to help pattern and set routines for students, to have that second adult to be able to help students as they're entering the school setting and being able to acclimate in that way. And then also be able to provide some support as the teacher's doing some initial assessment and so on. We have been able to extend that support from 10 days to 18 days the past 2 years. And many schools then have pooled some of those resources and extended that out by half days and so on to maybe make its way through the first trimester. And so our proposal was to add additional days to that bank to be able to extend at least one of those paraprofessionals on for a longer period of time, specifically to support kindergarten and if necessary into perhaps some of the first grade classrooms as we move forward into the year. And so that was certainly well received and felt like a necessary expenditure by our elementary leadership team. They did have some suggestions with regard to that element of flexibility. For some schools, looking at maybe more than one person, but less days. Other people saying, no, I'd like to have the same person and extend that out. And so what we'll be doing is looking at that in terms of a bank of days that can be accessed.
And along that line, one of the examples you gave last week was that perhaps if a kindergarten had some specials going on in the afternoon, they were choosing not to utilize their parapro help during that time when the children were not in their Gen Ed classroom, but rather extending that time over longer period of, adding other days in there so that they don't
rather than just utilizing full days if they weren't as needed, perhaps utilizing the morning and through the lunch period.
Right.
And then, so extending the day a bit past a half day, but being able to extend those hours out.
Okay, all right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Okay, are you all set on this one? And we're gonna vote on this, sorry, on Monday, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
I'll take a minute, the rest of the budget book, we did go ahead and update the rest of the funds. Again, didn't go into the level of detail we normally do, but at, minimum, we updated all the, beginning fund balances for the, first amendment of our other funds. Also, the next page is our funded projects fund, and made some, if we knew of some things, like for example, our Title I allocation, we had that finalized, so we were able to adjust that for the final revenue amount. In the special education fund, that was a pretty simple update to the beginning fund balance and some minor changes to the revenue and expenditures. That takes us to the food service fund. Again, and this was an update to the beginning fund balance, and the revenue stayed the same, and we updated the expenditures based on some of the discussions we had about putting some additional supports in place and capturing that additional expense in the food service fund. The health and welfare fund was an update of the beginning fund balance. Moving on to the debt retirement funds, again, we knew in June what our debt payments were going to be for the coming school year, so all of those expenditures remain the same, but we did update the beginning fund balances for the debt service funds. Update the scholarship fund, we got an extra $1 higher than we thought, so captured that. Updated the beginning fund balance in the bond fund, and then also updated the expenditures, the capital outlays. We put in there that we'd expend the all of the bond funds by June 30th. More than likely, we're going to have some expenditures that maybe go past June 30th, so we might see that carry on for another year. The next page is our capital projects fund. Updated the sinking fund, beginning fund balance. Everything else remained the same. Again, updated the technology fund. I did place in their expenditures under the technology equipment. We had discussed our next round of Chromebooks coming out of that technology fund. So I captured that in this amendment. The next one down was the capital projects fund. As I discussed when we were talking about the general fund, because of where our fund balance is, recognizing that sale of proceeds in the capital projects fund. And then we've got a placeholder in there for some projects. When we do utilize that fund, that's something that's going to come back to the board for approval, and then at that time we'll reflect that in the budgeted expenditures. And then last but not least is our school activities fund. So this is a new fund, or not new fund, but new reporting related to GASB 84 that came out that requires us to have the board approve the revenue and expenditures for that, and qualifies as a special revenue fund. So that is the budget book. Obviously, the big changes to the general fund, but some minor changes in the other funds I wanted to mention.
Anything else, guys? All good? Mrs. Frank?
I just wanted to say that I think that what you captured, Mrs. Oquist, was really great about taking some of this money and giving it back to our students and our teachers. And I think this was a great item that we were able to share with our staff and with our students and with everyone who was presently entrusted to us. And so I just want to thank you for your team's guidance of how do we utilize this money and how do we give back to the kids and how do we serve them better with the kids that we have now. So I just want to thank you for all the different options that you've put out there for them, because I think it's a really exciting time in our district for the kids to actually see some differences. So thank you.
Okay. Mrs. Smith, We are gonna talk about the financial statements now.
We are.
And I want to be
Oh,
clear that
sorry.
normally October is the financial update, so it will be an amendment.
Yep.
So we'd like to put that on
On
the
the vote,
regular,
yep.
the regular voting, meeting of October 28th.
Yeah.
For our next item, the financial statements, we've got some friends with us from Plant Moran. We've got Lisa Vargo and Dan O'Donoghue. Thank you. Just a reminder, so in the board packet was some highlights from our financial statements. Dan's brought a copy of the draft statements, the full copy, but they're quite lengthy, a lot of
Yes.
detail in there. So what we'll do is go over the packet that was included in the board packet. But we do want to have these for your reference though.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you. I want to thank everybody for giving us the opportunity to be here and talk to the board. If anybody has any questions, I always just reach out. We're always welcome any questions of anything that we can help with throughout, the path of the audit and after the audit. As Allison said, we're going to do things just a little bit differently. I think in the past, what we would do is we would pull through that whole report and we would end up like flipping through a lot of pages to just get to some key pages. And so we concluded to kind of extract that and put it in a package to the board of what we kind of felt were kind of the most significant pages for us to talk about. And Dan's going to go through some of that. But what I also wanted to point out is the financial statements are still in draft, so they still are going to go through our proofreading and processing department, clean them up, pretty them up, so we'll have them at the final board meeting. But it gives the board any opportunity, if they have any questions about how certain things are worded in the footnotes, you can give me a call, and we'll hold off a few days before we press that go button in processing. And so, just wanted to point that out. As we've said before, the financial statements are really the property of management. Allison gives us the information. We provide the service to pull the financial statements together. The only thing in these financial statements that would be like Plant Moran's would be the opinion letters, and that's essentially what we are hired to do. So when we kind of are going through our audit process, our brainstorming, our preparation, is we think about what do we need to do to make sure your financial statements are free of material misstatement. We can't and we don't look at every transaction, or we'd be here forever. But we really key on materiality, and we really key on like what is the risk? Where do we really need to kind of focus in on? We also then, in that letter that we sent to the board before we started the audit, that would be our initial game plan, and then I would report to the board if there's been any variances from that game plan, and there has not. So when we came in here, the books were ready as we would expect, controls were set up just as we expected. So I'll cut to the chase. The opinions on both the basic financial statement and the single audit are both unmodified, which would be the highest level of assurance that we can provide that your financial statements are free of material misstatement. So that's fabulous. The single audit, we had 2 compliance programs this year. We had to test both child nutrition and Title I. In both those programs, we had no findings. So we did not find any findings around internal controls, compliance, question cost. So we did not find any of that. So again, a clean opinion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and he's going to highlight and talk about some of the statements in the financial statements. And then after that, we'll kind of talk about the end of the audit letter and some of the recommendations. And honestly, most of that letter is informational, like what is coming down the pipeline for K-12 districts.
Alright, so if you want to start off on the governmental funds balance sheet, the first statement after the letters. And this is the fund level balance sheet for the 3 major funds, which are the general fund, special education fund, 2013 Series 2 fund, and then the total for the non-major funds. Just some key balances to point out. One of the larger assets for the general fund, the $24.6 million due from other governments. That's the state aid receivable. That's the primary balance for there. The accrued liabilities and other, $10.7 million. That's primarily payroll for the accrued July and August pays that you have to accrue as of June 30th. And then looking at the fund balance, I know Allison already touched on what makes up the approved purchases, $1.5 million, and then the assigned subsequent year's budget of $1.1 1.1 million, which is just the original budget's expenditures over revenue. The next page is the same fund level, but it's a statement of revenue, expenditures, and changes in fund balance. Same as last year, the primary revenue source is from the state, which is primarily the state aid foundation allowance. Local sources, 31 million, that's primarily property tax revenue. And then if you look at the inter-district sources, that 10 million, 6 million of that is the enhancement millage that was discussed earlier as well. Total expenditures for the general fund are 160 million, which is very comparable to prior year. That was 158.6, so given the increased cost in a year, that's right in line. If you look at the other financing sources, the one item I want to talk about is the proceeds from the sale of capital assets. That was a sale of land, and that's a one-time revenue from the sale of land. There will be not all the amounts were received this year, so 575,000 will be recognized last year, but primarily that's a one-time revenue source. Which brings us to a net change in fund balance of positive 8.4 million, which gives us an ending fund balance of almost 31 million, which is 19.3% of expenditures, and as Allison mentioned, it's right in the MSBO guidelines of 15-20. As a comparison, the state average last year was around 14%. And then another way of looking at that percentage is that's the equivalent of 10 weeks of operation for a school district. So those high percentage, that money can go.
And as Dan pointed out, the average of 14% for other school districts, and that's kind of like a big, you're comparing really little districts to really big districts and combining it all together, and that would have been last year. We don't have the data point yet for where it's at in 19. I suspect, based on what we've been seeing in a lot of our districts over this past year, that I suspect that state average will also be going up a little bit, would be my guess. But.
And one other thing to note is that that percentage, that's of the total fund balance, which is not just the unassigned balance. That includes the assigned balance, the non-spendable committed portion. So the next page, we have the budgetary comparison schedule for the general fund, which I know Allison already talked about a little bit before this. But overall, it was the actual was right in line with budget. Generally, a 1 to 3% variance is indicates an accurate budget, good forecasting, and revenues were over budget 1.4%, so that's right in line.
42, he's on 42.
Well-
None of us can find that.
42?
Sorry, 42. That'd be the next page after the statement of
Is that where you're?
Yep, it's page 42.
Thank you.
The page numbers aren't in order
Okay,
because they're
okay.
extracted from the report.
Okay, no problem.
Yep. And then the expenditures, all the function codes were below budget. In total, 1.9% variance, which again is right in line. The one I guess a little bit larger variance, like in total it's still right in line, is the 1 million for the pupil transportation and services, and 850,000 of that amount was committed for bus purchases, which is included in that committed fund balance.
Just to elaborate while we're on that, we discussed it last week too at the meeting. So we had taken the bus purchase earlier to the board this year. I believe it was taken maybe in February in the hopes that they'd be received by June 30th. And we did work with the vendor throughout the year and touch base to make sure they're still planning to come in by June 30th. And we were assured up until the beginning of June that they'd be coming in by June 30th. And then that's why I included them in the final budget amendment. And then, lo and behold, they didn't come in before June 30th. So that's something I want to work on this coming year. We'll be bringing a recommendation to the board for another bus purchase. And that's something, and maybe working with our legal counsel to say what kind of parameters can we put in place to maybe hold the vendor more accountable for keeping to their word. So.
And again, the main takeaway, expenditures, the variance is 1.9%, which is that's very accurate. So. The next page is the budgetary comparison schedule for the funded projects fund, and this, along with the general fund, makes up the combined general fund, which is presented on those front pages. So we wanted to include this just, if you're totaling them to see where it comes from. And this is traditionally a break-even fund, so it's expected the fund balance to be 0. The next page, we have a statement of net position. This is the government-wide full accrual statement for the entire district.
Hold on, what page is that?
Oh, sorry, that'd be page 10.
10, okay, thank you.
Maybe next
Sorry.
time we'll impose
Oh, no, that's okay, just as
corresponding
long as
page
it,
numbers, yeah.
yeah.
And we
They're
probably
not
confused you by
chronological.
giving you the financial statements and then having the finance packet. So if you're looking at the finance packet, it goes in order by the pages, but the financial statements,
Maybe that's what it
jumping
is.
ahead.
Yeah, we
Yeah, the
have,
one that's in your packet is following that.
Oh,
order.
it's following this order.
One that's in
Okay.
your board
Should have
packet,
clarified that one.
not the separate one today. The one
Sorry
that's in your
about
board
that.
That's
Yeah, I
okay,
can-
so you're on
Okay.
10 right now.
Okay.
Yep, I
Okay,
can give the
perfect.
page number going forward.
Yeah,
if you
that'd be
kind of
great.
look there,
Perfect.
So we can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, right.
I'm just going back, just give
Same
us the
thing
page
online, the
numbers,
one
that's
that's
all.
online is
the one
is the
that's
one
going
Yeah,
that Dan
we're
is going
up
through.
there.
Okay.
But if you're using the paper copy of the full report, it's page 10. that we're on
Okay,
right now.
perfect.
So this is the statement of net position, which is the government-wide full accrual balance sheet. The main balances that differentiate this from the fund level statements are, you can see the capital assets of $264,000, and those are all your buildings, land, property, equipment, buses. Some other balances are the long-term liability, or the long-term debt, and the net pension and OPEB liabilities as a result of the GASB 68 and 75 adoption in recent years. If you look down, the unrestricted net position is a negative $330,000. However, that's consistent with other districts under the MIPSER system. That's a recent liability that was put on the books, which has a net impact of $364 million. So if you do remove that, it is a positive number, but with that addition, that's about a negative. The next page, page 16, which is the statement of net position for the Health and Welfare Fund. And this is the account that's used to account for the risk management programs for workers' comp, healthcare, and disability claims. Its ending net position was unrestricted at $1.4 million. Next, towards the back of the financial report on page 37. Find that. Going back to the the MIPSER's liabilities, the net pension and OPEB. This page is some of the actuarial assumptions that were made to create that liability, just to show what goes in, how that was created. It's basically a product of it's made up of investment, the rate of returns, discount rates, trends in mortality rates, healthcare cost trends. A lot of numbers go into this, and if you go to page 38, towards the bottom, you see the sensitivity of net position liability to changes in the discount rate. This just shows that changing that assumption by just 1% can drastically affect what that liability is. The MIPSER's program, it's still active, and the numbers aren't, they're still working towards that amount. And as years go on, it'll get closer, more accurate. But these can change, and with small changes in the assumption, there can be drastic impacts. And then the next page, page 39, that just shows a few more, changing the discount rate or changing the healthcare cost trend by just 1%, and showing how the OPEB liability can change quite a bit. And the district has no control over these numbers. It's their proportionate share from the state, and it's calculated by the actuary, but it is on the books. So these are where the numbers are derived from. And then the next page in the packet, this is not in the printed financial report. This is a page from the single audit report. So if you have the packet, it's the next page. And this just shows, it's overall like a summary of the audit results for both the single audit and basic audit. As Lisa mentioned, we tested, the 2 programs that we tested were Child Nutrition, Title I. There were no question costs or findings, no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, and we had an unmodified opinion. So this is a good summary page of. And then the next page, or next 2 pages, this is the schedule of schedule of expenditures of federal awards for your reference. I'm not going to go into all the numbers. This is basically all the categorical federal revenue. So as you can see, you have the federal funds and payments received of $7.8 million, and then the federal expenditures of $8.5 million.
Thanks, Dan.
Right.
So, before we get into the letter, I'd like to take a step back and see if anybody has any questions about the report. Any of the final numbers?
Does anybody have any questions? You guys good so far?
Wow, good.
Okay.
All right, thank you. So the last part of the package would be what we would call the end of audit letter. And so the first part of this letter goes to the board, and it's very specific from auditing standards about exactly what we have to say. So, but this is really our avenue to tell the board if anything did not go as we planned. And as I indicated before, everything went as we originally planned, so that's great. This letter also gives us the avenue to let the board know if we had any difficulties with management, any disagreements with management, and we did not have any problems with management. Everything went very smoothly, just as anticipated. The other item to point out in this letter is on the second page of this letter, which is labeled third on here, we do talk about that there were no new accounting policies adopted this year. So as in last year, we had that big change of GASB 75. There are no significant changes to your financial statements this year. A little bit of wording in the debt footnote, but nothing significant. So we wanted to point that out. Also, we wanted to point out, as Dan talked about, the most significant estimate in your financial statements has to do with the pension and the OPEB cost. So we just want to point that out because it's not a black and white number. It's the liabilities calculated by an actuary, and there's a lot of assumptions which are out of your control. You're not choosing those assumptions. That is what is part of that plan. So we just wanted to point that out because that does have a significant impact to your overall financial statement and the disclosures in there. On the next page, there's a header that's called corrected and uncorrected misstatements. This is where if we come in here and we propose a journal entry, like a material journal entry, we need to tell everybody. So we did not identify anything through our procedures that identified any material adjustments. Allison and our team did work. There was what we refer to as a past journal entry, which means it was not material. We decided not to record it onto the financial statements, but it is attached to this letter. And essentially, it's just a timing issue. So in the general fund, you have to receive under modified accrual the monies within 60 days. This money came in after 60 days, and so the decision was we're just going to keep it in the year as reported and not unrecorded and recorded in the next year. So it was not something that we found. Allison and us all talked about it, and based on the dollar amount, it was concluded that it was probably actually easiest for the readers just to keep it in this year.
You guys remember talking about that?
Yeah.
Yes,
Just for those that weren't here last week, so that was a payment that came in on September 10th related to the grants. So, like they were mentioning, we decided to leave it in the 18-19 record.
So that's what that attachment is. So that is what we refer to as the end of audit letter. And then the next set of information we have is really more just informational for the board. So we've kind of grouped them into what we refer to as other recommendations, and then I think what we call them informational type items. So we just wanted to put this recommendation out there. Many times we refer to them as operational or efficiency reviews, and just kind of taking a step back and looking at different departments and just making sure you're maximizing your IT, maximizing efficiency as best you can. It's just always good to make sure you kind of keep that from perspective, particularly when you have retirements or moving around of employees. So we did not identify any issues. It was just something that we always like to keep at the top of our mind, to be like, you know, it's just something to always keep in mind as you're kind of looking through your staffing models. As far as the informational, I got to commend Allison. She did a fantastic job discussing the foundation allowance changes, because those are changing all the time, so great job. The one thing the takeaway I would have from here is there is uncertainty with it. You don't know what's going to happen for sure yet. We don't know exactly how the new governor is going to fund everything and where all this is going to shake out. As we stay informed, we will keep Livonia informed as well. So all that funding from the state kind of takes up the next couple pages here. Fund balance, I think we hit on that. Dan talked about it, Allison talked about it. Just kind of as the point of reference where the average school districts are, we pointed that out in here. As we said, it was about 14%. You're within the MSBO recommendation, so that's a good job. But again, it's really being fiscally responsible and keeping your eye on the ball on what's going on. The next section in here, single audit updates. Really nothing to be concerned about here. We just wanted to inform the board and management that there is a change in how the single audit and the data collection form is submitted up to the government. So we'll get all that submitted properly for everybody, but there is a significant change in what's reported to the government now. And then on the next page, a couple of the upcoming GASBs. GASB 84. Already saw it in your budget, so I know you guys are on top of that. So great job there. That will be a little change in the report for next year. And on the next page where we say potential significant change, this is probably going to be something that we're going to see for years and years, continuing to see it. So there's talk right now of changing how some of the reporting is included in the financial statements. There's no date, there's no conclusions of what that's going to really mean, but we just wanted to keep everybody aware that there are groups that are talking about potential changes in the school district reporting formats. And then another upcoming GASB is going to be the GASB 87, which is when you put leases, operating leases on your balance sheet. This is something that's also having significant impacts this coming year for for-profit entities. And so as very typical, GASB will follow what we see many times in FASB world, and that's what this is doing. So it's putting your operating leases onto your balance sheet as like kind of a right-to-use asset. So so that is coming down the pipe. I think it's in a couple years from now. So
How are they gonna front load? How are they gonna, I mean, because we're already doing average, you know, we have to average our leases over, if it's a 5-year contract
Yeah.
and have the deferred rent and stuff like that. How are they gonna assess or
calculate it? Or
do we even know what they're basing it on?
I mean, I think there's gonna be a lot of information still coming down to inform us on that. The for-profit's gonna go through it first, and so I do think that there's a lot of discussion about that.
Okay.
And so just putting that right to use an asset along with your future liability, that will be what's gonna be presented on your balance sheet. So it's gonna be grossing up your balance sheet.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry. I didn't mean
No,
to
no,
interrupt.
not at all, not at all.
Sure what they're thinking. Okay. sorry, please continue.
No,
I'm so
yeah,
sorry.
no, that's a wonderful comment. And so just as always, informational technology and cybersecurity and items like that, particularly, you know, having younger students and their security and their information, we just always like to remind school districts that this is a really important area, and just to kind of make sure that everybody has their eye on that. So that's what we have for you today. We are happy to take any questions that anybody might have. Again, I know I said it earlier, but Allison and her team have done a fabulous job. They make our job easy when we come out here, and we have the cooperation of management. So we really appreciate being out here.
Questions, my board friends? Okay, can you do me a favor? I think, the financial statements are, obviously, they're a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of the notes, and it's kind of in the jargon. I think, can you just share a little bit about, when we get questions from the community, a lot of it is more about, are we following the correct procedures? Are we following all the state procedures? Are we, you know, it gets down to, are we posting to the right chart of accounts? You know, all that kind of stuff. So can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you do that do you know where I'm going with that the people are concerned about making sure that our assets are taken care of and reported correctly? Yes.
Yeah, so when we initially come here for the audit, we do assessments of controls. That is one of our requirements. We don't put an opinion on the controls, but we absolutely assess them. There are certain things that we look at. Safeguard of assets would be one. We make sure that we have there's segregation of duty, that somebody does not have custody of an asset, cannot record a journal entry, and then request and wire. I mean, so that's an example of what we do look at to make sure segregation of duties are in line, that you have the proper monitoring procedures, that things are in compliance with federal government requirements, which we do the single audit, so we are required to look at what the government requires us to look at. If we find anything, particularly in a compliance manner, we do need to report it. Materiality goes out the window when it's compliance. So we look at federal compliance, and then we also look at, make sure that things are in line with how the state wants things reported. So we assist and make sure that the reports are submitted up to the state of Michigan. We make sure that things are reported as the state of Michigan would require. And if it wasn't, it would be a finding or a question cost or an item that we would feel would rise to the level that the the government would need to be aware of.
Okay.
So that would have been attached to that letter. If we would have found any compliance issues, any internal control issues, or any finding costs, that would have been attached to that end of audit letter.
So I'm gonna impose on you
Yeah.
one more question. So, we talk about risk, assessment, and, I'm forgetting my audit terms, but, that the amount of work that you do is based on, can you talk about risk assessment a little bit?
Oh,
Because
absolutely.
I think that goes to what you need to look at in the risk assessment, in that if it looks like things aren't,
Yes.
you know, in the proper order, then what that causes you to do and the amount of additional work.
Yes.
Just as, again, I know I'm kinda
Yeah,
going,
no,
but
that's a
just as
great
a
question.
reassurance to everyone that this is an in-depth, this is not just about taking the numbers that Allison
No,
presents
right.
and slapping it on a page and adding footnotes to.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
No, that's a great question. So, because I just love all talk about audit procedures.
Who doesn't?
But, and so, but what we do is, when we come in, the first thing we do is we refer to it as baseline analytics. So we take the numbers and we look at them, we have all these ratios and modules that we look at historical information. We look at information that we have from the state of Michigan that will say, what's the average compensation, what's the teacher getting paid? We do these analytics, and then we independently say, is that what is recorded? And if it's not, then, exactly to your point, we have to go down this whole path of doing a lot more auditing, to be sure how things are recorded. So we do spend a lot of time like payroll is a perfect example, because there's a lot of what we will say independent sources that we'll pull from, and we'll look at it, and then once we look in, we pull from all these independent sources, is this what's recorded? And if it's not what's recorded, then we have to go to step 2 and do a lot of different things. The largest revenue source, state shared revenue sources, we get confirmations from the state. We get pupil count confirmation. So we look at all those aspects as well and compare it to what's recorded. Does that answer some of your questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you guys have any other questions, deep auditing questions? Mrs. Spring?
Not deep
auditing
questions.
Mrs. Spring, yes, Lord.
I just, can you remind me, we talked about mixers and
Yeah.
the OPEB.
OPEB, yep.
OPEB. What is
Other-
that? Tell us what that is.
Other post-employment benefits.
Okay, perfect.
So that was like the health insurance that employees receive in
Okay.
retirement.
And then, the other thing, whenever we have this statement of net position, so basically what you're saying is if to get a more accurate view of where we are as a district and what we own and what our liabilities is, you take the bottom number and although we have to, on paper, include this or take that off to get a more accurate reflection, and that would be the number.
Yes.
Basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
And just one other question, for, Mrs. Smith, is that they did not do our bond funds, correct?
They actually look at all of our funds, but
Okay.
then we also employ another auditing firm, Yo and Yo, who we've already provided our GL detail and will actually be coming later this week. And they look at our sinking fund and our bond funds. And that was something not required by the state, but in light of the fact that their sister company, Plant Moran Cressa, is our owner's rep for the sinking fund and the bond, we wanted to be abundantly transparent and clear to the community that it truly isn't independent. And I know what they are doing is independent, but this is just a little extra that we do have another company come in and audit our bond and sinking fund as well.
Which I believe is only required every 3 years, but we bring them in every year.
Yes. And they go along with what Ms. Bonnefield was saying about testing and the compliance, and they look to see, well, what can the bond proceeds be used for? Is what we're purchasing in line with that? Did we follow our board policies and the state requirements? And did we go out to bid when we should have gone out to bid? And they do that for both the bond and the sinking fund. So a lot of compliance testing there. Thank you.
Perfect. Good question. All right. Okay, so we have to vote on this on the 28th, correct?
Yes.
We have to put this on as the agenda item. And then, are we ready for C? What is C?
Like
The
to thank
summer
our guests?
tax resolution.
Thank our guests and
Thank
we'll
you so
see
much
you
for
on
coming.
the
You guys
28th.
are awesome.
If anybody has any questions, just feel free to reach out to us.
And Mrs. Bonnefield,
Yes.
we're voting to accept the audit report, yes.
Yes.
As presented.
Yes.
We're not voting on the numbers. We're voting to accept the audit report, correct?
Yes. Okay,
Got it.
thank you for
Okay.
I do
that
just want to share for the
clarification.
record,
Thank you.
it has been a pleasure working with Plant Moran. They are so flexible and throughout the year too, just a great resource for us. And we have
Absolutely.
something new coming up and, we can run our ideas by you and make sure that it aligns with what you were thinking too. So thank you for that partnership.
Well, we'll see everyone in a couple weeks.
Thank you
Thank you so
very
much.
All right, guys, ready? We're moving on to the summer tax resolution.
Okay, this one is much shorter than the last two items. So this is something we bring, it's a standard item here for Livonia Public Schools. We do a 50-50 tax collection. We collect 50% of our operating and sinking fund and debt millages in the summer, and then the other half in the winter. And the law requires us to pass a resolution. So this is a little bit earlier. We got this from Trune earlier, so we thought we'd add it to the agenda. Because it isn't a change and it's our continuing with our current practice, I did want to see if the board would like to put this on the consent agenda for next week.
Good?
I'm fine with that.
Consent is fine.
Mhm.
Excellent. Does anybody have any questions for Mrs. Smith? Pretty status quo stuff? Okay. Are we good with that one?
Yes, thank you
All
very
right,
much.
we are, oh, I'm done. Woohoo,
Shocking. Thank you, Mrs. Barnes.
it's all good stuff.
Then, then it'll take us to item 5, our building and site, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Centers.
Great. Item A is consideration.
We have.
This is Opus.
I'd like a point of privilege, President Johnson, and add an item C under building and site, Mr. Centers, athletic field contingency. So we did have a brief conversation with President Johnson. We wanted to update the board and get your feedback on one item, so if we could add that as item C under your committee items.
Sure.
Yep.
Thank you.
Item A is consideration of sale of property. Mr. Francis.
Thank you very much. I am currently working to put a PowerPoint up, so excuse me one moment to turn on the TV.
So I'll give some background on what Mr. Francis is going to be going to cover this evening, and some information that we thought would be helpful for the board. So as you know, we've been spending some time over the past few years talking about the sale of property, the vacant land owned by Livonia Public Schools, and certainly each time we've gone through a thorough building use and facilities audit to take a look at what is currently being utilized, how it is being utilized based on our enrollment needs and programming needs. Those are always in-depth and important conversations with our board. So we've also spent some time taking a look at our board policy as it relates to the sale of property, and recently have discussed going out with requests for proposal on some of our vacant pieces of land within the district. So we thought maybe that it would be helpful to both the board and the community to just share some background information on the properties and facilities within the purview of Livonia Public Schools, just a reminder of where we've been, and some of the considerations that our board makes as we approach the sale of property. So really just providing some additional background information to you as a springboard for continuing that conversation.
Thank you very much. So we just have a small handful of slides, and just to kind of generate the conversation. The first slide is titled District Property Statistics, and it just brings to the reminder that the district has property throughout the boundaries of the district, mostly the city of Livonia and the northern portion of the city of Westland. We have approximately 3,000 square feet in actual building space and actual facility space.
3 million.
3 million.
What did I say?
3,000.
That's smaller.
Yeah.
3 million, yes.
3 million.
Considerably.
Considerably. Approximately 3 million square feet of facilities and approximately 700 acres across the district of land. Now, a lot of this started last fall when the board had directed us to get some valuations on 5 different properties. So since then, we've reviewed that summary that Bill Bowman had created from Great Northern Consulting, and we came back to that again, and we've talked about some of what we've learned. But again, the larger picture, 3 million square feet and 700 acres of land across the district. And that obviously takes personnel, it takes maintenance, cleaning, it is paying for utilities, paying for insurance, there's security of properties, there's even when there's not a building on the land, there's still insurance on that land, there is still maintenance that must be done. For example, we put some drainage in over at Dickinson property and over at what is being rented by the city as Meese Park, so near the Grant Elementary, that is actually Livonia Public Schools property, and we put some drainage in there. So we have to continually mow, maintain, and keep an eye on these things. So just to bring those numbers, which are very much larger than 3,000 square feet, somewhat staggering to see that type of number. The next slide we have is just to throw a couple of numbers at us for historical reference. So for our K-12 schools, at the peak in 1970, this district had 50 school buildings. We had 36 elementary schools, 10 what they called junior highs at that time, and 4 high schools. It's amazing how massive Livonia Public Schools was at its apex. It was the third largest school district in the state of Michigan.
38,000 students.
At 2006, and that date wasn't picked out of thin air. That's actually, the numbers that I'm showing here are right after what we all know as Legacy Initiative, when several buildings were closed after the 05-06 school year. So at the start of the 2006-2007 school year, we were at a total of, I don't know that I actually wrote, yes, 25. I've got a glare on it, my apologies. 25 school buildings. So actually half of what it was at its peak back in 1970. We went down to 16 K-6 buildings, 3 what are middle schools now, and 3 high schools. And we also have the Career Center, the Wayne Western Skill Center at Ford. That was the Ford Skill Center, and the early childhood at the time was at Perrinville. And bringing us to today, we're still floating around that number. We have 24 K-12 school buildings, and you can see we have 15 K-6 buildings, still 3 middle schools, still 3 high schools. LCTC is still there. Skill Center has been moved to Garfield, and it's Garfield Community School. And the early childhood has been moved to Jackson since 2006. So again, just some perspective, and I put a little note at the bottom just to remind folks that we do have other buildings currently that either have lessees in it or some other program occurring, or perhaps even empty. Okay, so the numbers up there, we're actually counting where we have some K-12 school programs.
And really the intent of that is just to say, why do we have vacant land, right? So there is some land that has been sold, but the question is, why do we have that property? Did we buy that property? So just as a reminder for the board and for the community that we have some of that vacant land because we used to be much larger back in the 70s.
And we are still a large landholder in the city of Livonia. We just used to be even larger. So this didn't come from nothing. I mean, we have a history, and that's where these properties were for us. So just also going back to January of 2015, we did those forums, and we asked staff and we asked the community for their feedback on 2 important questions. Essentially, what are you holding most important? What's the highest priority that you want Livonia Public Schools to try to preserve? And the second question was, what would you recommend, or what would you be okay with the district doing in order to help preserve what you had stated in the first part? And you can see, and we've brought this back on different occasions and had these conversations with the board, that current K-6 class sizes, maintaining elementary support teachers at the K-6, maintaining extracurricular activities for students, and maintaining special or magnet programs and opportunities were the highest items that staff and community had stated they wanted to preserve. And in fact, those have been preserved. And then they said, what items were staff and community would say that they'd be interested in implementing in order to make those that come true. And you can see that sale of property was at the top of that list. And this is the wording right from the survey. Sell property or other assets not projected to be needed for future school use. Also, to increase out-of-district schools of choice, to increase paid participate fees, and to close a K-4 elementary school. All 4 of those items have actually occurred based upon this survey and based upon the past almost 5 years now from that when we got this feedback.
So again, none of this is new information. This isn't current information that people are suggesting. This is just a review of, why did the board make some of those considerations over the past 5 years? And really that feedback from the community at that time was very helpful in guiding some of those decisions.
Next, we've got just some information about closed buildings and vacant land. We were talking about how it was the 3rd largest school district in the state. We had twice as many buildings. Well, just since 2015, so we sort of are looking at the time when we put out that information, got the feedback from the surveys of what you want to preserve and what you would be willing to do. Since that time, Washington Elementary has been raised and sold. Perrinville at Adams, remember the small Perrinville Island, as I lovingly call it, was moved into the former Adams Elementary. That was moved out of there, and those programs were relocated to other buildings. McKinley was raised, and it's currently used by Franklin High School. Bryant had a couple of small portions. The first one was back in 2012, but then more recently in 2017, another small portion, the board remember, was sold to St. Mary's. Cass, Garfield, and the Ford Skills Center were closed in 2017. And to that end, adult ed, shared time, and adult ESL programs were moved into the smaller circle at Cass, and the larger circle is actually leased out for childcare. And the Western Wayne Skills Center moved into Garfield in January of 2018 after that building was renovated. And then Ford Skill was raised, as was Clay. And Clay, Nankin, and Ford were sold together, and the original Parentville were all sold. They were put up together in 2017, but we have 2017, 2019 because there's been just different timelines on those sales. So that just brings us up to date also on what we've done in the last handful of years. Is there a question anywhere? Yeah.
Just a point. This last handful of years are not the only handful of years during which Livonia Public Schools has sold their property. There are obviously going from 50 buildings down to our 24 buildings, even with the properties that we still own that are not being utilized for K-12. Over these past years, from the 1970s through the years that we're talking about right now, the early 2000s, there have been many pieces of property that the district has sold.
Certainly, and I think at one point I put together a list and shared it with the board showing about of former buildings and what their status was, and looking back in the archives to the when those were sold, and there are many areas that are homes right now that years ago,
Bentley.
you know, Bentley's the rec center. I think the old Lincoln is now houses, and there are many of those that go down the list. Good point. So the question might come up, how much is left? So the remaining vacant land that the district has is approximately 200 acres currently. It's either vacant or has a non-K-12 building on it. So just to be fair, it's not completely vacant with a raised building. That's the combination of completely vacant land or land with a building on it that does not house any K-12. And the proposed sale of Adams, Old Webster, and Wilson equate to approximately 30 acres.
Of that 200.
Of that 200. So you'd subtract that out if we no longer own them. And then just noting, just to be fair and not try to miss anything, about 65 of the 200 acres is likely not suitable to building development. We've got some wooded area, etc.
Some wetland area.
Yes.
So you're saying then that the school district owns 700 acres of land in total?
Correct. These are approximates, obviously, give or take.
Right. 200 of which we are not utilizing for K-12 purposes right now.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
And when you do the percentage on that,
That's a staggering percentage when you look at it like that.
Yeah, it's a pretty good percentage. Okay.
And we thought this would just be helpful in the context really of Mr. Center's question last week, which is, could we have the bigger picture?
Right.
What is the long-term picture? And we really felt like in order to be able to start that conversation and have that, it was helpful to have this all within context. Because sometimes when you're talking about just one individual parcel, it sounds like one conversation, but I think this is just always helpful for us as an administrative team and for the board and for the community to really have this all in context.
We were just looking at a sheet that had a lot of the different sporadic dates where different properties were sold.
How did we come to acquire 65 acres of non-buildable land?
So some of it was just deeded back to the district, literally, decades and decades and decades ago. And so some of that are some areas that are adjacent to other school property. And just simply, it would not be suitable for a wide variety of reasons. We've been advised that it would not be buildable. So we just wanted to make sure that within that, we were clear on what is potentially an area that can be developed and then an area that really does not carry value for that purpose. And also would not be an area in which we could build a school in the future.
I think that's a good point to make, Mrs. Oak, is we don't have 65 acres of individual parcels where the whole parcel is non-buildable. Most of that 65 acres, I'm imagining, is adjacent to properties that, or is part of a larger piece of property. So maybe 3 acres on a 5 acre or 7 acre lot is wooded or has the ravine running through it.
Or adjacent to a property that we may have owned in the past and maybe don't own currently, so,
Okay.
yes.
And again, just kind of following the trend of enrollment and facilities needs. So one of the questions that may come up is, well, what if we need to start building schools right away? Because there's so many students that are showing up in Livonia Public Schools. Well, the reality is actually that we still have not stopped losing students. We have not even stabilized. We continue to lose students each year. So the district is not foreseeing a large influx of enrollees. Now, I don't want to be over dramatic, but I know that we have out of district schools of choice that we've done the last few years, which has certainly made the overall number look a little different than what our enrollment would be without it. So just want to be clear that right now we're looking at from the Plant Moran Cressa enrollment study that we had a few years ago of hopefully leveling off in the near future. But as we stand now, we have not stopped losing students. We still are, and we're not even at the point of where I would say at least, and I think you would agree, Ms. Oak, is that we're not leveled off yet, if that makes sense.
So I just want to clarify the wording just a little bit, that it's not so much losing students, it's not as though students are, just as we take a look at that, as we look at numbers exactly year over year. So as you know, we've gone through and talked about that the cohorts of students that are graduating out have been in the 12 and 1,300 student range, as we bring in about 950 kindergartners. And so naturally you begin with an enrollment decline because you're graduating out more seniors than we have students coming in. And we've seen this across the state of Michigan.
Right.
Our enrollment decline has truly mirrored the enrollment decline that we've seen across the state. There are simply less school-age students in Michigan. There are less children being born. We follow, as you know, the live birth data out of Lansing. We know generally what our capture rate is in Livonia Public Schools for those live births within our boundaries. And then we help project that out 5 years later of how many kindergartners we anticipate. And quite simply, that number has just declined across the state of Michigan for many years. And again, our enrollment decline has slowed. And so where we might have been losing 300 to 400 students a year because of that differential, those cohorts are beginning to even out a bit, and we'll see that continue over the next number of years, and then hopefully look at just a stabilization, so that we're bringing in approximately the same number of kindergarten students as we have seniors heading out. Now, within those 13 grade levels, there's obviously fluctuation. We always have a pickup at middle school and high school because that is a more natural transition point for families. And so there are certainly, we know what those points are, but overall, we are still in an enrollment decline, as are many districts across the state, quite simply because there are less school-age children.
And we should also remind ourselves that we have become one of the, best communities to retire in the country. So
And millennials, so we have both ends of the spectrum. The second hottest zip code for millennials in the country. Yes.
Mrs. Oquist, does it still hold fairly true that Livonia Public Schools has approximately 1% of the state's students?
It is. That is an area that has continued to mirror.
Okay,
the
and we're
state's
talking about going back
population.
years or decades.
Yes.
That we have about 1% of the
1%.
state's students.
Yes.
So to your point about the fact that this is a statewide issue, or I'd say actually a nationwide issue, really, families are simply starting to have children later and having fewer children. So we're just simply not, as a state, with extremely rare exceptions, every district is going through this exact same situation.
Yes.
And the main point of the slide was not to freak everybody out and for me to sound like a fool saying the word lose 4 times in a row, but rather to say we put up 2006 earlier when we all know that several buildings in the district were closed. At that time we had over 18,000 students, In 2019, we have 14,116, and you can see year over year the numbers as they change through. So just to answer the question about what if we need to start quickly building buildings, we still have land, but we also don't foresee an immediate need.
Yeah, and just to add on that, in Michigan last year was the lowest birth rate since the 40s in our state. So it's not like there's really an end in sight even.
And I think this district has done an exceptional job of staying on top of that and really utilizing our resources to our maximum capacity. And I feel like we are in an outstanding position right now with our school utilization, with our mitigating some of our enrollment loss by limited schools of choice. So I think the board has made some very, very wise decisions on use of facilities, monitoring the enrollment patterns and how we can mitigate some of that loss. And really, I think these are all things really to be proud of. And really, one of the reasons we wanted to reflect that forum from a few years ago is each of those items that our community at the time expressed were important and things we should consider are indeed things that this district has followed through upon, which has continued to put us in a strong financial position. Thereby, the students are now benefiting from that. And so again, these decisions never come in a 2 or 3 year pattern. This is the result of many, many years of excellent fiscal decision making, and during some much more challenging fiscal times, to be able to now be on that upswing of our financial stability.
Again, going to folks or students coming into our school district, whenever this topic comes up for discussion, inevitably someone brings up the point, and they're correct, that we know 3 families that just moved in on our block, and 1 or 2 of them are pregnant, and they're bringing in a couple of other kids, in each family, and that's fabulous. But literally, to your point, Mrs. Oquist, we need between 900 and 1,400 pregnant moms walking around every year in order to replace our graduating seniors who are going out. So that, we're not discounting that at all. And that fact is absolutely true, and thank goodness it is the case. But the number that we're looking at in order just to maintain is between 9 and 1,400, actually 1,400 if we're going to replace our graduating seniors on them this year. So, or somewhere in that neighborhood anyway.
About 1,200, yep.
1,200, yep. So 1,200, we're looking for 1,200 new babies anyway. So bring them in.
And this is actually the final slide, so just some considerations or thoughts that the future anticipated use of vacant land or non-K-12 facilities. So what do we anticipate the use of what we have? We talked about a couple hundred acres of such land. Some of it we said isn't buildable. Some of it we know has a building on it and it's being leased out. Some are vacant and have been for literally years. The old Jefferson site, the old Wilson site, places like that. Another one is the cost to maintain vacant property. That includes multiple things. So I say payroll, and that's man and woman hours going out to mow on that schedule. Especially, we all are familiar with the spring mow schedule, and when in the spring rain schedule, they don't seem to sync up ever quite so well. But the equipment, because we do buy and use the mowers, and when we're at high mow season, we're running those mowers all day, every day, including the weekends, to be able to stay up. So that is an equipment cost. We still insure those pieces of property. And as I mentioned earlier, and it's not in this particular line, every once in a while we actually have to do a little extra maintenance on that and have a company come out and do some work if there's a lot of standing water in an area that people expect that they're able to use it for. Some of our vacant land de facto becomes a playground or a play area for the community. And then there's a prioritization of maintenance. We've talked about this together, and just to remind folks that vacant property is the lowest priority when it does come to some of those types of maintenance. We are going to be in our K-12 school facilities mowing them for field day or for kindergarten roundup or just doing the regular mow. That's gonna be the top priority. Our next priority is gonna be buildings that we have lessees in. We're gonna maintain the exteriors and the grounds of those buildings. And then last on that list, specifically when we're talking about mowing or plowing, would be vacant land. And the final item up there is a budgetary consideration. The board would want to think about, obviously, we talk about the sale of property. It is a one-time revenue generator, and that is absolutely true. But it's also, when you have the property, there is an annual cost involved. So selling it is also a cost avoidance. If we're not mowing it, maintaining it, plowing it, etc., then that's also a budgetary item. So just some of the ideas to run through and to kind of back up the community who might be watching and to just put everybody on the same page of things that we've all discussed several times in the past.
So as a reminder of where we are, and based on our study session last week, you've requested that we put out a request for proposal for what is known as the old Webster property off of Linden, as well as the former Adams property also off of Linden on the other side of town. And then most recently, last week, the board had discussion about adding the Wilson property to that request for proposal. And so I just wanted to open that back up to the board and confirm that that is the direction that you've asked us to head, and if there's any additional information you need from us.
I had a conversation with a resident this week and shared that information with my fellow board members. And I understand the angst of community members when a potential piece of property or a piece of property that is adjacent to their homes is potentially up for sale, and the unknown of what that may or may not look like, and the loss of that open green space. And I don't blame residents. I would be equally unhappy. But where I sit right now, one of the responsibilities of a Board of Education is to utilize the resources for current and future school board use for the benefit of our students in our community. Right now, as I see it, we simply own more land than we obviously currently need, and I don't see any rational thought that we will be needing these pieces of property for educational purposes in the future. I totally understand that the community would like to leave them open as green space. But our responsibility is to utilize our resources. Our responsibility, I'm speaking of as the Board of Education responsibility, is to utilize our resources for the best use for our current and future students. Therefore, I'm interested in going out for bid on these properties and seeing what the value actually is. We have estimated thoughts on that, but to see what kind of prices those can actually bring in, both for the income for the school district, the removal of them as a time and cost liability for the school district, and to potentially open up some spaces for housing in our community, which we have far too small of an amount of available housing for the demand going on in the district. But it is not, for me personally, it's certainly not for disregard of unhappiness of community members who are in the immediate area, but rather our responsibility is to utilize these assets, and these properties are some of our assets for the benefit of our current and future students.
Mrs. Frank.
I agree with Mrs. Burton, and I think too, you mentioned earlier, just we are not the first board that has sold property. Mr. Francis prepared this, but 1973 they were selling property as schools closed from our most the highest in 1970s. That when you said our peak was they have continued to sell properties. And I think one of the things that we have seen is that trend. It is not, we have seen a solid trend now of declining enrollment. And so, and it is not a fact of if we do more recruitment, we'll capture more students. If we do, you know, there are different ways that we can market and we can do things. But as you said, it is a point of birth rate. There are not as many children. We know how many kids go to private schools or that sort of thing. It's not something that we can create students for. So I think that being very responsible, as Mrs. Burton said, with the property that we own, especially given the fact that we have so many years of data of declining enrollments and declining birth rate. I think going back to this, some of these buildings have been closed for a very long time and they've been sitting vacant, and I think that it is our responsibility for the students that are entrusted to us right now and in the next 12 years to be able to do something with the income that we could get if we sold it, and to do something differently. We, as you said earlier in the meeting, we certainly had good news about our budget, but we still don't have enough, and we still have lots of things that we would like to do and like to provide for our students. And so I think doing this right now and seeing what is out there, I think is a really responsible thing to do, just like the boards of the past have done.
Well, I just want to add on to what was said, in that you know, clearly we'll still have available properties for future boards to look at it should the needs arise. Even if these properties sell, there'll be a tremendous amount of land still. So, you know, again, I continue to look forward to the conversation of looking forward and seeing what is, you know, really the best use for the community for these properties. And, you know, I'd just like to applaud my fellow board members who were very thoughtful in this process and, you know, really think about the community as a whole and the good of the school district and the community. So, yeah, I think it's be interested to see what happens with these properties if we do get offers. But going forward, I feel like this is great for the district and for the community as a whole. Mr. Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Sanders. Initially, I was against marketing 3 of the properties, but I think Mrs. Bonifield made some very valid points that has changed my mind. I don't see any reason why we can't at least throw them out there. I also look at it in a little different aspect. I won't beat the dead horse. I think Mrs. Burton said it all and said it quite eloquently. But I look at it as trading one asset for another, because the position that we're in at this point is these funds will go into the capital projects fund. And we have a lot of projects that need to be done. So we're really trading one asset to complete some work on other areas, other buildings that we might not necessarily have the resources to do. So to me, it's I understand that you know, we're getting rid of some property, but the value of that is going into another building or buildings that we have. The other thing is that we'd love to see it residential. Obviously, more families, more children, but we can't control what the city may or may not allow in any one of those particular areas. All we can do is say this is what we'd like to see, but we can't control that. So I think from the standpoint of marketing the properties, I'm all on board to do all 3.
Mrs. Bradford.
I agree with all my colleagues. After doing a lot of due diligence and looking into, I appreciate Phil Francis for those slides and giving us the big picture, because I think that shows a good perspective as to where we're at and where we could go. And I am in agreement. I believe it would be okay to market all 3 of those properties and see what's out there and take a look at that. I think that is a responsible thing to do in the current situation that we're in. So I thank you, Colleen. You did say it eloquently, so I agree with you.
Mrs. Trevor?
Thank you. And I echo what my colleagues are saying. It's a good time to look at the sale of all three. I appreciate what Mr. Francis said about cost avoidance. Even though we sell land and that's a one-time source of revenue, not spending money on land every year, money that we don't have to spend, those dollars can be allocated elsewhere. And that is kind of a bonus savings for us. So I'd like to see that as well. We're not, as I said last time, we are not in the real estate business. We are in the education business. And to use those dollars for educating our students is the better use for us. Watching that land, it's lovely, it's nice to have green spaces, but green spaces don't educate children. Bottom line.
There's nothing else that will conclude item A?
Right,
Can
that's not a voting item.
No, but we're not gonna bring this to another, right now, it'll come up later.
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll go through the process of, right now, we've already begun some survey work at some properties. The RFPs will be up. I'll update the board as we proceed and progress.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Item B will be review of bid specs for raising Perryville Adams property. Mr. Francis.
Yes, you have a memo from me as well as a memo from Mr. Lau, Administrator of Facilities and Operations, and the bid tab on the public bid for the demolition or raising of the former Adams Elementary, some also known as Perryville at Adams. This was something that we had proceeded with before the board had even decided on putting out for bid offers on that property. We were going to remove this building. It's been sitting empty now since 2015, and we were proceeding to have its removal. So if you take a look at the bid tab, 1, 2, 3, 4, we had 6 respondents. We had a very nice response on this. And you can see there's a bit of a spread, but as you get down really to the 3 or 4 a little bit, they were a little tighter. Adamo Demolition out of Detroit was the low bidder. We did do post bids. Adamo is a highly respected, long-standing excavator and demolition company in Detroit. They've actually worked nationwide. They took down the Georgia Dome in Atlanta. They won that national bid and took down the Georgia Dome and working to get ready for the Super Bowl in Atlanta. They are working in the city of Detroit now with major projects. They took down the Silver Dome. They're taking down Joe Louis Arena currently. So they are a big firm and a well-respected firm. And I'll even say that our real estate consultant, when I mentioned the company that was the low bidder on, it said, "Oh, that's a fantastic group." So we've had experience with them. They've worked in the district. It's been some years, but they've worked in the district in the past, and we've had good experiences as well. So we are recommending Adamo Demolition out of Detroit. Something I didn't put in my letter, and I apologize, but I'll bring it up now. I do want to put approximately 5%. I'm just going to round it up to $20,000. So what you'll see at next week's, I guess I should say 2 weeks from now, at the board meeting, a recommendation for $386,235 plus $20,000 in contingency for a total of $406,235 will be in the cap sheet.
Mr. Francis, I assume in the interview process you covered the question of manpower. If they're working on such large projects around the Metro Detroit area, I assume that you probably already did discuss the fact that they'd have enough manpower to complete this project.
Yes.
On the timeline that we need them to complete it.
Yes, we did discuss that. They have plenty of crew, and an elementary school building is sort of a meat and potatoes for them.
Okay.
And they're confident, and our NTH consultants are confident. They've worked with them repeatedly, and we were confident with the conversation.
Thank you.
What final question is, when do you look for this project to start?
So the board will have it for a vote, and still not until the end of October. We're thinking it'll be over the winter time. I'd be looking at realistically, which is actually a pretty good time to do it, in the December, January timeframe. It's similar to when we took clay down. Like I said, it's a good time. It's a little colder. It's a little wet out. It's helps keep the dust down, and folks aren't wandering and walking around nearly as much.
And our team, as usual, members of our team will go out to that area of the community, either invite them here or head out to the school prior to the demolition. And so just to be able to provide the community with information about, so how do we raise a school, what protections do they take environmentally. These companies are dogged about monitoring air quality and all of those types of things as any raising takes place. So members of our team always go out and meet with members of the community, answer their questions, and that letter gets sent to all residents within a certain radius around the school.
And we have our consultants sent to each, the civil engineering firm. They go out and check as well to make sure that whatever company is doing the work, they do some monitoring, they make sure what's supposed to be removed is removed, those types of things.
Perfect. Mrs. Fonda.
Can we cover just a little bit about, I know we just did a lot of bond work on some similarly aged buildings, and we were able to do a lot of renovations, and why that's really not an option with the laws regarding bringing the buildings up to code and
Sure.
stuff. And
So if a school building has not been in use for purposes of a school building for a 3-year period of time or longer, any renovations that you make, you no longer have items that are under code grandfathered in, so to speak. So where you may be doing some renovations but not a complete tear down and rebuild, we're able to grandfather in some areas with regard to different types of glass between the hallway and the classroom, or different materials and so on. When you are starting a school that has been out of commission, so to speak, for 3 years or more, the state requires you to meet all new code as if you were building a brand new school. So it really does escalate the cost if you're looking to renovate a facility that's been out of use for more than 3 years.
which may be more cost effective to build a new building than
If that was your options in front of you,
to
yes.
renovate.
Yeah. And so as you talked about cost avoidance, I mean, one of the things, as we, do some low level of maintenance of vacant school buildings, including dealing with any vandalism or things of that nature. And so that's another piece as school districts look to raise schools that are no longer being used or would not be used in the foreseeable future. That is another cost avoidance that can be a positive as well.
There were no programs in there, so we did not have to move any lessees or anything like that.
All right, anything else?
Not on that topic, no.
Regular agenda?
Please.
Okay, item C is an addition from Mrs. Oquist. It's athletic scoreboard update.
Contingency.
Contingency.
Yes, so I'm going to let my friends to my left handle this item.
Okay.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist.
Yes.
So this goes aligned with what we were talking about earlier with our financial statements and the due diligence we go through to make sure that we're following policies and procedures. And policies and procedures are very closely monitored in the district. So we wanted to bring this item back to the board. Specifically, we thought we could do it as an update to the athletic projects that took place over the summer. We in particular have one item that we wanted to bring to you. We have a potential change order for our scoreboards and electrical work. This was something that was brought to the board in March, on March 25th. And this was a subset of our overall athletic projects that was approved by the board on February 4th. But because it was a separate motion, as we look at the documentation, it doesn't clearly state that the contingency that was approved by the board for the athletic projects on February 4th covers the electric and scoreboard project. So we wanted to bring that back to the board. As we are talking to our owner's rep, and I'm talking to Mr. Francis, that was the intent of the contingency, that the contingency was sufficient enough to cover all aspects of the athletic projects. But again, we wanted to be abundantly clear that that was what the board's intent was. So just to give you some background again, refresh your memory, the overall contingency for the athletic projects was approved at about $275,000. To date, we have spent just under $250,000 of that contingency. So we have room within the contingency for this change order for the scoreboards and electrical work. But because it was a separate motion, we just wanted to confirm with the board that you would be okay with us using that athletic fund contingency to cover this change order.
So will you briefly explain what the item is?
Yeah, and just as a reminder, because it's been now pushing a year, we had bid all the athletic individual items. The turf was bid the previous year.
Right.
But all of the work to be done was bid at one time, and we were not happy with the results of the scoreboard and electrical. So we pulled it out and said, let's rebid it. And we redrew some things and we rebid it. And when we came back the next month, which was March, as Mrs. Smith said, we had just sort of a narrow item. The intention was always for this to be a bundled athletic fields item. And looking at the contingency that the board did approve in February, we all sort of said, well, that's enough for the whole project. This was always supposed to be part of the project. So just as a clarification, we pulled that out because we weren't happy with the original result. We wanted to get a better pricing. As far as the specific work, so when you do the 3 buildings over 2 years, you start to go, oh, we did that over here. We've got to make sure we do this over here. And it actually worked with regard to the scoreboards. We put play clocks in the scoreboards at Stevenson and Franklin. So we had a base bid for scoreboards, which had obviously accompanying electrical work. And as an alternate, we had those play clocks. You put one at the south end, one at the north end. And when the board accepted that alternate, that meant we had to ensure that Churchill, because we already did a scoreboard at Churchill the year prior, we had to go back to Churchill and get play clocks for the north and south end zone. It was actually running the electricity. We had to do some pretty long borings to get underground electrical to the north and south end zones. And it was just an unforeseen amount of work that we had not predicted. We had predicted a certain amount, but we did not predict the extra work. So it essentially, that was the electrical work was the clocks over at, getting the electricity for the clocks over at Churchill.
So just to reiterate too, so this contingency or this potential change order is within the contingency of the project.
So
we're not asking for additional money, but I want to assure the board that if any project we do goes even a single dollar over what's been approved by the board, it's our practice that it has to come back to the board for additional approval. So again, because that's our policy, we just wanted to be abundantly clear that it was, that we have the board's permission to use that athletic fields contingency to cover this change order. So if you are comfortable with that, discussing it at this meeting and having it as part of our minutes is sufficient on the accounting side to document that. But if it was something that you would like to take further action on, we could bring that to the regular meeting.
Does anyone have any problem with that?
No.
I think you have consensus to concede.
Thank you.
Mr. Centers, could I just make one point of clarification? Mr. Francis, when you said we weren't happy with the result, if I remember correctly, we were not happy with the results of the bids.
Correct.
With
And
the
we
bid
sent,
coverage.
right, the bid coverage, and we
Yes.
sent it back out to bid
Correct.
again in order,
Yes.
right.
Correct.
It's not that we were not happy with the result of the work being done. It was way before ever
Correct.
anyone started working on it. We just weren't happy with the bids,
Right.
and we wanted more.
Which is why it wasn't part of the original February
Right, we
package.
pulled it out at that time.
We
Okay.
got really limited bid
Right.
coverage, and we just said, it's not worth going forward, let's bring this back out
Right.
in a little later. And
In
that's-
hopes of
and
having
that's what
more
we did.
companies bid
Yeah.
on the work and get better pricing and so
when-
forth.
And when that was brought forward, the total dollar amount was brought forward, but additional contingency wasn't added on that motion because it fell underneath the bigger. So
Yeah,
that's,
we
Right.
that's the
we just said,
clarification.
we'll use the
Yep.
athletic field, I mean, we just saw it as all one project.
Gotcha.
And,
Mhm.
and Allison is saying, noticed it and said, actually, because the board voted on just that item,
Mhm.
we wanted to ensure that you had the intention of it falling under the athletic projects.
And then I do have to give a shout out to Crystal Hicks, our accounting supervisor. She does look at all that stuff, and so she brought that to my attention. So I appreciate that all of the staff in the business office are very conscious of our board policies and procedures and are making sure that we are following them.
It's great to have that check and balance.
Yeah.
It's essential.
All right, thanks. Mr. Johnson.
Question that may be a little bit on a tangent. How are we doing with the play clocks?
You're talking about the wireless.
Yes.
The big test, if we went to Franklin, and we, like I did it, the vendor came out to Franklin and used the headsets and the play clock wirelessly, and in the simplest sense, used multiple channels to try to force it to fail and not fail. Found a channel that wouldn't, and we actually spoke to or communicated with Mr. Hamby, the athletic director. This Friday is going to be we asked him, said, is this Friday going to be the first real test? And he said yes. So we're going to see how that holds up under varsity game conditions. But that was the idea, was to try to get it to fail and to be able to pinpoint the potential failure, which was the cross signaling between frequencies.
Now, is that just at Franklin, or?
It was also at Stevenson. What we had done for most of the season was actually hardwired
Right, we were
to
doing
make sure it would
hardwired.
work properly until we could come up with an appropriate solution. So we're focusing on the Franklin move right now in their game this week, and we're going to get a report back on how it succeeds.
So if that works, we'll try it.
We'll try it the same.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Mrs. Bird.
Following up on that, is that just due to the fact that all of a sudden you put hundreds of people in there with cell phone usage and you're pulling all the data?
No.
Or is it something else?
It's actually the headsets that the coaches use are wireless, and they're sharing the same frequency as the board. It's not a concern at Churchill, because Churchill actually, when they got their board last year, was a different manufacturer who used a different frequency. The frequency of the boards that we procured for the Stevenson and the Franklin project on this past summer is on a it's a different company, so they're using a different FCC frequency, approved frequency, and that happens to be the same frequency that the wireless headsets that the coaches use are. And it's not all the time, and it's a few second delay. It just slows it down. The handheld controller in the booth is keeping the time the entire. It's correct. It's just having a glitchy few seconds to get.
Right.
Because
Onto the
wires
board,
get crossed to get to the board, so you'll see it at 11 minutes and 50 seconds, and even though it's counting down, it'll suddenly stay at 11:50 for 3 seconds and then jump to 11:47.
Gotcha.
So it's a glitch.
Can cause concern
in
among the fans.
And then yes, and then
Depending on
everyone's
which
yelling
side
at the
you're
core
on.
Yes,
scorekeeper to say start the clock, start the clock.
Uh-huh.
But
I'm sure they
yes,
do that with
that was why
utmost respect.
they used it with the headsets and to try to force a failure on different channels.
Gotcha, thank you.
Okay, that concludes Bill Jansen.
Thanks, Deb.
You are done, Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Thank you. That'll move us to item 6, policy, and I'll turn it over to Mrs. Burton, our chair.
Thank you. We have a few policies for revision and just information on the corresponding administrative procedures. And the first we will tackle is policy EB, building and grounds. And do we have a member of, Mr. Francis, are you going to be handling this?
Yes.
one? Okay, thank you. Go right ahead.
I want to thank Mrs. Smith for bringing this during the study session last week. I was at the MSBO Facilities Conference, and so I appreciate her filling in for me. We have board policy EB, which is under business management, building and grounds. We have just a few changes to update this back from June of 1988. I know the board has had this for the past week and had the opportunity to look through it. I'll read it in its totality as it's written with the changes, if that's okay with you, and we'll go from there. It shall be the responsibility of the superintendent or the superintendent's designee to oversee the maintenance of district-owned buildings and grounds. Upon request, the superintendent or the superintendent's designee shall provide the Board of Education with information as to the general condition of the district's buildings and grounds. Inventories of equipment should be maintained to protect the school district against losses from fire, theft, or any other causes. And as the board can see, some of it really was to update just sort of the language to make it consistent with other items. And really, there was some other parts about the specifics in a board policy, specifically stating building or heat or lighting, to just sort of give the ability to the board to ask for a general condition of facilities.
Are there questions or comments on this policy? Not sure if this should go to Mr. Francis or Mrs. Oquist. The one thing that jumped out at me was the last sentence. inventories of this equipment should be. Generally in our policy, we don't say something should be. It either shall or will be or something. It should be kind of connotes to me that it's a good idea. We kind of like it if you did,
Sure.
but there's some
Sure.
flexibility there,
Sure.
which generally is not how our policy is written.
Sure.
Are we okay with changing should to say will be
Or
That's-
shall be.
or shall? Either will or
Yeah.
shall, either one is fine with me.
Yeah, that should was original language, and if you
Mhm.
wanted to strike it, I can make that pretty easily if that's the.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think I'd say
Is there-
Shall or will? Or shall or will?
I think
Shall.
will, like,
Yeah.
we
Oh, I
will
see.
do those
Shall.
things in that way.
I'm just clarifying that for each of those items, that we do keep inventories
Well,
in
that was going to be my second
in that,
question.
in that
Oh,
way,
Is-
because I always wanna make sure that we're obviously
it-
Right.
in compliance with that.
If you look at how it's been modified, all it says is inventory of equipment should be maintained to protect the school district against losses from fire or theft. So we
Oh, so
do.
maybe you should keep it.
Yeah.
It doesn't have anything,
Should
it
be
doesn't say like
maintained.
computers, or it doesn't say boilers, but we do
Oh, I see
know
what
what,
you're
we do
saying.
inventory our
Yeah.
computers, we do inventory
Mhm.
our large equipment, and it's actually something that, and she's not here right now, but.
Okay, as
and
long
this
as
is-
the this is taken out, because otherwise, my suggestion was, do we keep inventories of every piece of plumbing equipment?
Well,
for
that was my
instance,
next question,
And each
is-
toilet,
is-
each sink.
Right, is
That type of thing.
inventories really the appropriate word? Because I really don't know that we want people spending their time running around counting every single item.
Mhm.
Sure.
Having an idea of what we own, I'm just not certain that, and I'm gonna defer to you folks on this, is inventories really the right word, or is there a better connotation that we can have here?
Right, because as
What
part
about
of
just
the,
equipment,
as part of the
records?
long-term facilities plan, we do have,
Right.
we do identify plumbing, electrical,
Right.
lighting, all of those types of needs,
And
and
large
then.
items we do wanna make sure we know so that she can, like I said, I was gonna
Right.
call you, but she appreciates them over time, et
Right.
cetera, so.
And models and serial numbers and so forth.
What about
Records,
just equipment? You couldn't just say equipment should be maintained?
No, I think,
That's different.
I
That's a
think I
different
would
language.
comfortable with the broad inventories,
Inventories.
of
Okay.
capital equipment or capital assets, are maintained to protect the school district, or something of that nature.
But in reality,
As long as you
this
don't-
paragraph doesn't even talk about equipment. You've taken that out.
Right, it talks about buildings and
It
grounds.
talks about
Oh.
buildings and grounds.
Oh,
So we could say facilities assessment of buildings and grounds shall be maintained. Because we do keep that, facilities assessment continuously updated.
Assessments of such.
and Mrs. Okus, that's because the portion of that sentence that we struck appears
It's
in
gone.
administrative procedures, where we have stricken buildings, heat, light, plumbing equipment.
Actually, most of this procedure does not really, is not an inventory, it's mostly about key and card access is the procedure.
Okay.
you could almost just strike that last, because can you check to see if we should have policies that are board policies talking about how we inventory our stuff, how we keep control over our stuff. So it may be that we can strike that because it's duplicated in another area.
Because we.
I don't know that it is. Is it?
No,
Why
well,
can't you
that we
just say
need to check.
buildings, district-owned buildings and grounds shall be maintained to protect the school district against losses? District-owned buildings and grounds should be maintained or will be maintained to protect the school district.
That changes
Yep,
that
yeah.
Well, that-
changes the intent of the
Right,
sentence.
they're not talking about what they're maintaining, they're talking about keeping records.
Well, but you're talking about the condition of the district's building and grounds, so if you're talking, you want the buildings and grounds to be maintained and protected.
I think what this-
I think you gotta get rid of, cause you just took out building, heat, light, plumbing, equipment, you took that out, so this is specifically talking about buildings and grounds, not equipment.
Yeah.
This is talking, you're saying, you're going to, buildings and grounds will be maintained to protect the school district and theft and other, no?
But what they're saying, what this sentence is saying is the inventory is there to protect against
Mhm.
loss So we know what we have, so if some of it walks away in the middle of the night, we'll realize that.
We could actually take out the phrase "of this equipment" and just say inventories shall be maintained.
I think it would be appropriate to say inventories of capital assets.
I
Yeah,
like
I'm okay
that.
with,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
That's better.
And that is, Mrs. Okus, that would be in keeping with our current practice and reasonable request of the district that we do that.
Yes, and we need to do that for insurance purposes
Yeah.
as well.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. The only change I'm gonna make then is I'm striking the word equipment and replacing it with capital assets.
Yep.
And the rest of it can remain. Is that
No,
what you're
what,
saying?
Mrs.
and
Smith
should
weigh in on this
is
one.
gonna be replaced with shall.
Yeah.
Oh, you do want shall on there?
Yep.
Okay. Should be shall. Shall
Hang
shall
on,
be
Mrs.
shall,
O-
shall be shall?
Yes.
Should be shall.
Mrs. Jarvis?
And being nitpicky, district-owned should be hyphenated.
I'm gonna put it in Allison, I was gone last week.
In the second line?
Yes.
I'll catch it.
Yeah, I think
Is
capital-
there-
So, Mrs. Smith, we're reviewing that final line, where initially we said inventories of this equipment should be maintained. And Mrs. Burton, correctly pointed out that we normally, don't just put things in that are suggestions, in board policy, but rather what are the expectations. And then as we looked at that, it was really referencing the strikeout area. And so instead of saying this equipment, we would recommend changing that to inventory of capital assets shall be maintained. And I just want to confirm with you that's an accurate statement based on the needs for us to not only have that for our budget, but for our insurance inventory.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
Yes, and for even in our financial statements that we went over, that we have a footnote related to capital assets.
Okay,
So
that's
we
what I
do
thought.
keep track of what additions have been made throughout the school year, as well as any reductions, anything that's been sold or disposed of.
Okay, so would you be comfortable with that?
Go ahead. I believe so. The only thing is, I want to just make sure we're not going to be losing anything by removing from policy that we're going to have an inventory of heat, light, plumbing equipment, and construction, and condition of the instructional and other equipment. I mean, that's,
most of that stuff that you're talking about is
Well,
gonna be a capital asset.
okay, then we're fine.
And so we're covered. Now, I'm not sure, we'd have to get into the nitty gritty about talking about buying beakers and all that kind of stuff, but I think capital assets, reflects where we're going, because we're talking about grounds and buildings. Part of the buildings is the plant
You're right.
portion of that building, so I think it actually covers it better. Capital assets covers it better than just equipment.
Okay.
Yes. It goes more with the.
So that includes technology and other types of equipment. Is that
Okay,
some of the thing you're
excellent.
talking about?
Exactly.
Okay.
Which we
Yep.
do inventory and
Okay.
have
Yes.
records.
Right.
And that's part of our
Have
capital
them
assets.
Okay.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we're
Nope.
getting to your question.
That's, you did,
Okay.
and that's right. Mrs. Frank, did you have another comment or question?
Question just about, so is this the only policy we have about buildings and grounds, basically? Because, and the only administrative procedure is about keys. I guess I'm just,
It doesn't match.
I guess just when we've just talked about 200 acres, 300 acres, we have a lot of, I guess, I'm all for a succinct, policy, and I'm not necessarily saying to add that buildings and light and heat back, but I'm just saying, does it reflect accurately our expectation as a Board of Education, as administrative team, that we do the best that we can to maintain these properties and to be fiduciary responsible, to have a fiduciary responsibility for evaluating them? I mean, I guess, is it covered somewhere else? I mean, this is a huge amount of our budget, and to have like 3 sentences, I just don't know if it accurately reflects, unless, if you guys can correct me, there's somewhere else that this is reflected.
Let me take a
And I don't
look.
know if this helps, but the very next one, EBB, is a bit of building grounds as well. It used to be called safety program, we're looking to change the safety protocol, and it has to do with the safety checks of the general grounds, of playground equipment, et cetera, those types of things, and also items that potentially could be prohibited because they could be hazardous, a fire safety concern, et cetera. So there's, if we get into the next one, or when we get into the next one, you'll see the changes made in the administrative procedure with regard to preventive maintenance, state and local requirements, and then potentially prohibited items to update that one. So that's also something with building and grounds regarding, you know, the protocol of daily checks on equipment and the general grounds, to that end.
I'm not
I-
necessarily
you know-
meaning, daily checks, more.
So there's a provision under the district organization board powers and duties, labeled school facilities as one of our policies. The board is responsible for determining school housing needs, for communicating those needs to the community, for purchasing, leasing, or selling sites, for approving building sites, and approving building plans that will support and enhance the educational program. So that's not so much about maintenance, but it is, you know, that's one policy that talks about our responsibility with regard to school facilities, and I'll continue to look at that.
There are others also, I know that there's a policy too that discusses the fact that it's reflected in state law also, that it's the board's responsibility to buy, sell, lease land, et cetera.
Right.
And that we
You're
have.
looking more maintenance or grounds?
No,
or-
just, because even inventories of capital equipment will be protected against losses, fire, theft, but also, for the good of the district, you know, in the best interest of the district to review, in the best interest of the district. You know what I'm saying? Like, not just that we look at it just in case we have a fire, but we are monitoring, we are protecting, we
And the
are.
property would fall under real property as well. We do have board policies about disposition of property, real estate, et cetera. So there are some that's kind of a tangent off of the building. I mean, it's the building and
Yeah.
grounds to what you're speaking of right now.
Yeah.
So,
And just to add on, this maybe falls under like an administrative procedure, but one of our current processes, the district participates in a pool for our insurance for casualty and property insurance. So as part of that, there's a consultant that comes out, a loss prevention coordinator, and comes and walks our buildings, you know, does the bus yard, and looks for things that could be a potential risk to offer recommendations. And then we take those recommendations and discuss them with our administrative operations and with our building supervisors. So that we do, if there's any potential risk for fire, or if, you know, if there's things that can be corrected, that's something that we look at on a regular basis and address, so.
and that's actually who we worked with on EBB.
Right.
And got her input.
Yes.
your input.
Maybe
Yeah.
just ongoing study or something, ongoing evaluation of our buildings. I don't know, is that necessary, or do you guys
Mrs. Briggs,
are comfortable with that?
Let me ask you if this is kind of what you're getting at. If this would be the policy that I think you're getting at in terms of best place, but all district-owned assets shall be used for the maximum benefit of the students, staff, and community? Is that the idea of what you're getting at?
Yes, just something.
It's not, yeah,
It's
we could
not.
add it.
Okay.
I mean,
Yes.
it's kind of implied, but,
Right.
but I think this is what you're getting at
It's
is.
a lot of money, it's a lot of assets to just say that
Right.
we are monitoring it for more than just loss. You know,
Right.
That, I think that's exactly what I'm hoping to put in there, that we actively are
Mhm.
watching it out for the best interest of the district. I think that's what I'm looking for, yeah.
And if we went down this road, we could write it, this is a first stab at it. All district-owned assets shall be used for the maximum benefit of the students entrusted to our care. But knowing that some of those assets also are utilized for staff. I mean, for example, staff lounges and so
Right,
forth.
right.
Some are utilized for the community.
Could say in the best interest of district operations, or.
Yeah,
and
of district
something-
operations, yeah, I like that even better, that's.
Or students entrusted to us as well as community, as well as our community?
The problem with that, and I hesitate even though I wrote it, is that I don't want someone interpreting it that the utilization for the community would trump the utilization for our students.
Right,
For example,
right.
someone who wanted to utilize a football field and they want it on Friday night, and the policy says it's for the community. Well,
Right.
it's gonna be for our students first.
Right.
But therefore, Mrs. Oquist, I think we all are on the same page with that, but district operations,
Which
Which
many of our statements talk about putting the needs of students
right.
first,
Right.
and I think that would be appropriate without that being
Mhm.
misconstrued.
Yep. And we could even say district operations with the needs of our students we could get ourselves into muddy water there.
Mhm.
Brevity is probably better. So, is that the gist of what you're getting at, Mrs.
Yes,
Frank?
yes.
Are the rest, before we go any further, are the rest of the board members comfortable with that kind of a statement being put into this policy?
Yeah, I think that's good.
Where were you putting it?
Just it doesn't matter to me really which order the sentences are. At the very end is fine with me. If that,
Do you mind
Yep.
giving it to us one more time?
all district-owned assets shall be used or utilized, I guess, either one, for the maximum benefit of district operations.
Of or for district operations?
Of, I think.
And you'd like utilized instead of used?
Probably,
Utilized,
but I could
yeah.
live with either one.
Okay, we can add that as a final sentence.
Thank you.
And then this will go for a first and second reading, so if folks decide they have suggestions to tweak that, we certainly can. Mrs. Bradford?
I just have a question.
Mhm.
The board policy EB, business management, buildings and grounds, and then
Mhm.
it goes to administrative procedures.
Mm-hmm.
And then it talks about keys and proximity cards.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how that really goes. I don't know if that's opening. How does that even go with this buildings and grounds?
It's entrance, it's
Access
to all of our buildings.
Okay. Sorry.
No, it's a stretch. I mean,
it
it's.
is a
yep,
stretch, because
yeah.
I'm like, it doesn't
Mhm.
really match with your buildings and grounds. I mean, it does.
Yeah.
It goes a little bit with the buildings, but not so much
Okay.
the grounds.
Mhm.
Is there, Mr. Francis, did you have the opportunity to see if there was a place where that procedure would fit any better?
I
And
don't
is
know
this-
that it does,
Okay.
and even the grounds, I mean, my key gets me into the gates and the,
Sure.
you know, those
And
types of things
that's
as well.
Yeah.
staffed
And,
and
Yep.
and
make
I,
security.
the appropriate personnel have keys into, for example, Bentley Field, which while we rented, it is still district property. That is, only certain people are granted that type of access
Okay.
for specific reasons. That's the best thing.
Okay.
I'm trying to help the folks
No,
from
I know.
09 who did it.
I know, I'm sorry.
But it
But
really,
what-
I don't know where else.
What
The only
about
other place, the next
security-
one, the
security
next
and
policy
grounds or
that talks
something?
about safety protocol.
It could be in
I mean,
there.
it could fall underneath
if you wanna
there.
have it safety, but yeah.
Yeah,
I'm not married to anything, I'm just trying to clean up what is
Sure, I
there,
just-
and so I'm happy to go
I mean,
whatever
to me,
you
it
guys
seems
make
more for
sense.
security than build, I mean.
I think it's a good suggestion. I think we
Yep.
thought it was a bit awkward. That's where it existed.
Okay.
And I do think that certainly under EBB, putting it under business management safety protocol, because this really talks a little bit more about the management
Yes.
of access to.
I think it
building
lends
and
itself to be
grounds.
better for EBB, but it's,
So we would need to have that be, we would
How do
need
you
to
do
have that
that?
titled EBC, because we have an EBB, no, an
No.
EBBA, right?
It would just be EBB.
No,
the
it just-
EBB is the board
procedure.
policy.
it would just be this administrative
And then we have an
procedure
EBB,
for-
administrative procedures, she's saying to just tag it on to
To
the
EBB
EBB
as a
procedures
safety
as is already.
I think I'm totally lost. I get your idea, but can you tell me that again?
So there already is an EBB board policy.
Yep,
And there already is an EBB admin procedures. She's
Yep.
saying just to have maybe two headings, like business management, safety protocol. I'll get rid of the I'll get rid of the liability prevention at the top, make that one section of EBB safety protocol, and then section 2 can be key and card access of this will be a bit longer procedure.
You're just talking about the procedures?
She's saying to move the procedures, not the board policy.
So move these, the key card access information,
Over to
Over to
EBB.
EBB.
over to this administrative procedure.
Mhm. It's just
You know what, though?
procedure. Yeah.
I'm totally fine moving it under EBB, but I think it still needs to be a standalone, because if people are searching, doing a keyword search, it's, what they're looking for is gonna come up, yes. What they're looking for is gonna come up if they hit a keyword. I'd rather have it be,
Like EBB 1, EBB 2?
Yep.
As procedure?
yep.
Oh, I see, but move it to EBB.
Move it to EBB, that's fine, but leave them both as two standalone. So EBB would have two administrative procedures under it.
I would agree, that would be better.
Mrs. Frank and then Mrs. Bonnefield?
Nope, go ahead.
No,
Jamie.
I'm not, do you have administrative procedure? I'm going back to EB. If you're,
EB.
yeah, I'm going back to this, so.
So I am too.
Okay, so, go ahead.
So there's no, just so I'm clear, there's no administrative policies for we will maintain properties.
Oh, she's back to that.
No, administrative, no, I'm going back to administrative procedures.
For which one?
For
EB.
EB.
Mhm.
Like to give a building supervisor direction on how to maintain the building, right? So we don't have any administrative procedure, like buildings will be
I understand your
maintained,
question.
subdued.
Oh,
Actually
I understand
change
your
the
She's saying
That's a
there
good
should be
question.
an administrative procedure.
Other than key cards.
Mhm.
Right.
Well,
Like,
and
sorry.
actually, under the safety protocol, that is specifically for the building supervisor. In fact, we
Right, but-
switched it from, that would be the daily walk is something that we are trying to enforce as being a daily check. And that has been moved from the original statement, and I know we're hopping here, but
Right.
it originally said principals in coordination with the custodial staff. We've turned it into building supervisors in conjunction with principals and educational staff and whatnot. The building supervisor of each building is responsible and should be responsible for those checks. For the safety of students, they check the equipment, they check the general grounds, they clean up if there's trash,
Right.
whatever.
Right,
So
I'm
that
not talking
that
about-
does go under for that ability.
But I'm not talking about safety, I'm talking about
The maintenance of
the maintenance of the
school
building,
grounds.
like how they're responsible for
I get what
maintaining
she's
the
saying.
school
Yeah.
grounds, not just for the safety issues, but for
Managing the
we
grounds.
sweep
in
the
building.
floor every 3 hours or whatever. You know what I'm saying, like that
Mhm.
type of thing, and I don't know
do,
that they're.
But
But that's not us. We
I
do it.
I don't,
No, we don't, but there should be one.
I'll write whatever you want.
Yeah, well, it's an
You know what,
administrative
Mrs.
procedure.
Frank, I
I'm
think
not
it's a
asking
great
about
Yeah, I know,
question.
I'll
So why
I'll
don't
write
we,
something.
why don't we take a look at what may or may not exist
Yeah, 'cause I'm not
currently?
sure.
Do you
Yeah.
know what we're saying?
I do, my concern is, are we gonna write the steps for every employee up to what is your job responsibilities? And I think that's sort of the
Right.
job responsibilities of custodial staff and building supervisors. And so I don't know, but I can try to write you something and you guys can help me,
I see what you're saying.
maneuver.
Mr. Centers?
My question is, do they already have, they already have a job description?
There's a job
An administrative
description.
policy that would tell them what their responsibilities are.
Wait, but I do know what Mrs. Frank is saying, so I mean, I'm happy
I get
to.
what she's saying.
I'm not saying,
Let me-
but I don't mean sweeping the floor every 3 hours, I'm not meaning that specifically, but I just think it is an important amount of money that we have invested into our buildings, and I just, and maybe there is not always an administrative procedure, but I just think it's a big asset that we have to just make sure that every building is
no,
being
we'll-
maintained.
Let me make a suggestion if I may. We're responsible for the board policy. Our administration is responsible for administrative procedures. So it's probably already covered either in administrative procedure or in job responsibility. Either way, it's not the board's responsibility to know all the nitty-gritty details of it, but rather just simply that it's covered.
Yes.
So therefore, can we request of our administrative team that you folks take a look at that topic and just let us know in the next month or two,
Yeah, whatever.
whether or not it's already covered?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, because even administrative procedures are an FYI for the board. They're not for us to,
Right, that's what I.
to detail and, so, Mrs. Frank, your point is well taken. Let's make sure that it is codified somewhere.
Yes.
We're just not sure in this room at this moment where it is, but we'll have our administrative team verify that and get back with us on it.
And a side note, they meet monthly with Mr. Lau, both the maintenance department with the supervisor of maintenance and Mr. Lau, and also a separate meeting monthly. All building supervisors, both night and day supervisors, meet monthly to review different protocols, what is important now, those types of things.
Yeah.
So that does occur, but as far as a written procedure, I'll dig in and get you guys some information.
Mrs. Bradford?
Okay, so then that leads us to board policy EB is going to be rewritten, and that administrative procedure for EB we're suggesting to move over to EBB and make it a two-step.
Like an
process.
EBB one and
An
EBB two.
Yes.
Okay,
Mhm.
okay.
Is everyone comfortable with that portion before we dig any further?
Sure.
Mrs. Bonnefield?
So there's one change I'd like to suggest and then one, it's hard because we've gone over it, whether or not it's relevant. On the very last sentence,
Where are we?
on EB, sorry,
Oh, it's all right.
where it says, protect the school against losses from fire, theft, or other causes. I think that's kind of redundant in old language. I would like to just end the sentence at against losses
Sure.
and clean that language up.
I'm fine with that. Are there other opinions on that?
Okay, so my second
Wait,
one.
why would you drop that? I don't see.
To make it less limiting?
It's just words.
Against losses of what?
Of any type.
Of any type.
So rather
against
than beginning
losses.
to list what types and then saying and any other types, we'll just
Oh.
say losses, period.
Okay.
Flood,
Okay.
technology.
Yeah.
All right.
and-
Okay,
and plus-
losses, period.
Okay,
got it.
so this is my other one, and I'm not sure if it's a good suggestion or not.
Throw it out there. Everything
Um,
else has been thrown out there.
So, if, starting at the beginning, it shall be the responsibility of the superintendent or the superintendent's designee to oversee the maintenance and use of district-owned buildings. I don't know if we're making too much out of it.
I think that's two separate things.
Too much.
Yeah, just
Okay.
of the.
Well, because we talk
It's
about.
probably covered in other areas, but
So-
we can double check it and get back.
The reasoning for that is
Mhm.
that new last sentence
Uh-huh.
talks about the use of, we're talking about use, not
Oh,
maintenance.
yeah, you're right.
Oh,
In the
all
last,
district
that
owned
new
assets shall be
last
utilized.
sentence.
You're right. Mm-hmm.
So,
Oh.
I'm not sure we need that new last sentence.
this is probably gonna wind up going to another
Yeah,
committee.
maybe we
That's
should.
okay.
Oh, yeah, I know, but it's funny the things that we do. So, but yeah, so I don't know, if you wanna throw it in for parentheses, so the next time we read it, we
We
can
can discuss
kinda
it.
I think at this point we need to kinda just
Move on.
write it and then reread it another time.
Why don't we rewrite it and include it in your update this
Yeah.
week? We have a little
Okay.
bit of time
Mhm.
before the first
Okay.
reading because we have
Oh,
a
yeah,
bye
the
week.
2 weeks, yes,
I don't know,
we
is that
have
only in football?
Yeah.
Or can you have bye weeks in board
Bye
meetings?
We don't.
We will not have a formal meeting next week, so it would give a little bit more time if you'd like to give feedback.
Yep.
That will also give us some time to take a look
Yep.
into Mrs. Frank's question as
Okay.
far as other administrative procedures that are related to this and or
Is the best use of this
district
paper clip.
documentation,
Mhm.
perhaps in the form of a handbook or something that we provide that we could refer, to me, that would be something to reference in here if that exists.
That sounds
That gives
great.
us some time to do that. Does that make
Yep.
sense?
Yeah,
Makes
and
sense.
I agree with Mrs. Frank, we're talking about some, very short paragraph about a very big
Yeah.
asset,
That
you
we
know?
just spent a lot of time talking
And-
about, yeah.
And,
Yeah.
so I think
Yeah.
it behooves us to get it right.
Sure. Yep.
But in our quest to cover all our bases, I don't want us then to fall into the trap where we're being redundant or we're changing
Mhm.
the, what
Yep.
the gist of the, cause sometimes we get in too deep and then we start changing the whole meaning of what, the policy is, so.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think taking some time to reread it and just kind of mull it over a little bit to see,
Okay.
where we're at is gonna be helpful.
So the last, just so there's,
We don't have the same page.
we have a cross off of from fire, theft, or any other causes. Is that still?
Yes.
Okay, that's still straight. And then we have the sentence that, that all district owned, et cetera, that's still in, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but
You guys can
I
decide.
guess why is that sentence in there? Can you explain why we're adding that?
I don't understand why we need that. To me, that seems obvious. Everything we own, by virtue of the fact that we own it as part of our district, we
Is
have
for
it to be
maximum
utilized for the
benefit.
maximum benefit of district. I mean, what is the best use of this
What-
paperclip?
Yeah, what,
it needs to be
But if we're
utilized to
talking
the
about a
best way.
paperclip, it's one thing. When we're talking about millions of dollars worth of assets, I just think
Yep.
we need to say that
Mhm.
we are being good, we are all elected officials, that we are being good, responsible,
Mhm.
responsible owners of all of these assets that we've been entrusted to. I just
Mhm.
think if it's, I don't
I
think we
agree.
need to say a lot about paperclips, but I do think we have
Yeah,
millions,
but aren't we
millions
talking
of
about
dollars.
the plumbing and equipment and
Yes,
things like
property,
that?
plant, and equipment.
So-
We're talking about the capital assets, so we are not talking about paper clips.
I just don't, this seems so blatantly obvious.
So,
But you know what? A whole lot seems obvious to us sitting in a room, and sometimes out there somewhere. I don't have a problem with adding it in.
so
Mrs.
can,
Bonfield.
can I make a suggestion
Sure.
that we put it in,
Yep,
mull it over, cause this isn't
Yep.
set in stone.
we have 2 readings
And
yet.
we're
Yeah,
gonna,
okay.
I think this really is one of those things where we've kind of
Mhm.
maneuvered around that we really need to
Mhm.
just step back from it, take a second look, take a breather, and then.
Well, and investigate what else is already in policy
we get-
elsewhere.
There
Yeah,
you
get some
go.
additional information, and then we can revisit it. And I would rather leave more in than
Mhm.
less, so that we can, it's easier to pare down than
Yep.
add back in.
Okay.
But, I think everybody's points are well taken, I think it's just one of those things where we wanna get it
Yeah,
right.
and we need to do a little more investigation than what we can do at this table right now, but we
Yeah.
can do it over the next 2 weeks.
You bet.
We'll have something in our packet, we'll have some more backup in our packet, and we'll have first and second reading yet where we can.
Do we still wanna bring it to the board meeting as a first reading, or do we wanna skip the board meeting and take it to another committee of the whole?
I think we can take it to the meeting for a first reading, knowing that there's also going to be a second reading,
Okay.
and the purpose of both of those readings is so that we can
Make change.
make changes if
Okay.
need be.
All right.
That they're
And I
not
think if the
done in one meeting.
administration needs more time, or they can get to a
They can
point where
let
like,
us know.
you know what,
Absolutely.
this is gonna be.
We can always
and
pull
you
it.
can pull it and say, let's just
Absolutely.
wait another week, let's give us another month to work on it. I don't think, I mean, if you're gonna be writing policy or, you know, retweaking it, I don't think we have to force it in 2 weeks. But if you think
Yep.
you have it other places and you guys are ready, I think we can do it too.
Okay, so I've got it down for a first reading at
Sounds good.
10:28, and then.
Yep, and we'll pull it if we need to. Okay, are we good with EBB, or EB rather, and the procedure? Shall we give a stab at EBB?
Oh, boy. Okay,
Mr. Francis.
Phil.
He's gonna run away.
EBB. Business Management Safety Protocol. The administration shall attempt to prevent accidents from occurring by taking reasonable precautions to protect the safety of all students, employees, visitors, and others present on district property or at school-sponsored events. It is the responsibility of the administrative staff to assure the safety of children while under the supervision of school district employees. The staff shall adhere to recommended safety practices as they pertain to the school buildings and grounds, special areas of instruction, student transportation, school sports, occupational safety, etc. Each school's principal or designated leading administrator shall be responsible for the supervision of a safety program for his/her school. The superintendent or designee shall have overall responsibility for the safety program of the district. The superintendent or designee shall inform appropriate staff members of current state and local requirements relating to safety protocols. And as a quick, because the last paragraph has something that I struggled with as well, but I want to give the background of why it's there. The original reading said each principal shall be responsible, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have a principal necessarily at
Mhm.
every building.
Right.
And the best that we could come up with was somehow a phrase that is who's ever designated the leader of that building
Yep.
is the person that is responsible for this. Because, again, we don't have a entitled principal at every building.
Right.
So that's what that, just if you were wondering where that weird
Nope.
portion came from.
Sounds logical. Mrs. Bradford?
Would it be better designated lead administrator
I-
instead of leading?
I do, this is my, if you wanna know why I hesitated very, very much from that, is that for several years, this district had a title of lead administrator at a building.
Mhm.
It was a specific
That's
title.
why I'm
Yeah.
thinking
And
of
so
that,
I didn't
right?
want to use it because it was in fact
Right.
a specific title.
And we
A
don't
lead-
have one in
Whoever the
every-
leading
Right.
administrator is, maybe the principal's on leave for a
So the
month,
leading
and one of the
administrator
assistant
would be the
principals is
Oh.
leading that building for
Yes.
the month.
Okay.
Maybe
Yep.
we have a retiree who came
Gotcha.
in
Yep.
Okay.
and is sitting in.
And it
as
was sitting
the-
in that kind of a
who-
role.
Whoever, and that was sort of the spirit of it, but I
Okay.
understand if it doesn't
Yep.
make sense when you read it, and that's what I was hoping to get feedback on.
It works for me.
Do we still have lead administrators?
We did as until the very recent
Right.
past, like a year
Maybe-
ago.
Maybe take out the word leading and just say, or designated administrator.
Honestly, I'm open to it. That one I struggle with, whatever
Leading
you guys
just
think.
doesn't sound right to me, designated leading administrator, I don't know.
So to that end, if it was just each school's principal or designated administrator, would that mean that the principal of Stevenson High School could say, you're in charge of all the safety protocols, and is that what we want, is that they then designate somebody else to do it?
And
Mrs. Brown?
so on a building like Dickinson that we don't have anybody in, who would be the designated, would it be?
The maintenance guy.
Well, that's exactly the point. There are,
Yeah.
for our non-traditional K-12 buildings, for buildings that have other purposes, we have other administrators who are over them. They have a variety of titles.
Yeah.
I kind of like your phrasing, even though it's really intentionally vague, so that it covers whatever the person's title who may be.
That could be me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, that could be another ALT member, that could be
Yeah.
Mr. Willenberg as being the director of secondary programs,
Right.
if it's a former secondary building, or if that program that's
Right.
in it. I mean, I guess it is purposely vague, but that also can be concerning, so I wanted to just
No, I
be
think
very
it's-
upfront
yeah.
with what that meant.
I'm fine with it being intentionally vague. Sometimes our policy is intentionally vague so that it covers a variety of scenarios that might be presented. Mr. Centers and then Mrs. Bonnefield. No? Okay, Mrs. Bonnefield.
So, Phil, instead of saying each school's principal, can we say, oh no, that doesn't work. I was gonna say each building's, I don't know, never mind.
Okay.
School's fine.
Mrs. Opus.
I'm gonna suggest in the third paragraph, unless do you wanna stay on designated leading administrator?
What
Are we okay with leading administrator for the time being?
Yeah, just, go
Okay.
ahead.
Dan
I'm
loves
gonna suggest in the, third paragraph,
Yes.
the second line, that instead of school sports, we just say school activities.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Yep,
Sure.
good idea.
I like that.
Sports, where's that? Oh,
Lots of activities going on. Are there any other suggestions to be made at this point? Mr. Johnson?
Going back to EB, Mr. Francis included, he added, where it says superintendent or the superintendent's designee.
Mm-hmm.
In the fourth paragraph, the second and third line, it simply says the superintendent or designee. In keeping with consistency, shouldn't we include the superintendent or superintendent's
Yep.
designee in both of those lines?
Yep.
yes, oh.
Nice
again.
I was hoping you wouldn't see that.
That's why I carried that blind squirrel. It helps me see these
We're all
things.
okay with that?
Where?
Yeah, that
Good.
makes sense.
Just down in.
Fourth paragraph,
Fourth paragraph,
second line.
yeah, second
No,
line.
go
It's in
back
the
to
choice,
this.
actually.
Second and third line.
Right
Oh,
here.
I
Yep.
thought he said
The
EB.
superintendent or superintendent's
EBB.
designee.
Ah, got it.
He
Yes.
did reference.
I did
Yeah.
Went back to
reference
that.
EB.
And
Yep.
then it has to be in the next one. All right.
Okay, are we okay with EBB?
Sure.
And knowing too that we've got time to digest it and think about it and so forth. First and second readings are for the purpose of going through it and making sure that it's reading the way we want it to read, so.
Okay.
Are we all right with that? All right, so EB and EBB will both be on our next agenda for first reading. Any comments on administrative procedure EBB, recognizing that administrative procedure EBB is not for board approval, it's just for our information. So is there anything that you need to comment on about that? Nope?
And
Okay.
just so the board knows, and I mentioned this before, the person that Allison Smith was talking about from Maisel is someone that we reached out to and gave us the input, and the potentially prohibited items came from Maisel, which is the group insurance for our
Gotcha.
neighboring district. So we got that information from them. We didn't flat out prohibit them because sometimes they're appropriate to have some of these items, or it depends on if you pulled something
Right.
from the trash or if you just bought it
Right.
from, new from a store. Those are two different things. So that's just to give you a little background.
Okay. Are we okay with going on to EBBC?
Yes.
Okay, policy EBBC. Mr. Francis.
Business management emergency drills. The superintendent or the superintendent's designee shall develop and implement, in cooperation with appropriate local agencies, any drills, plans, or other arrangements to meet such emergencies as fires, tornadoes, lockdowns, or other such events, natural or man-made, which require special measures for protecting the safety and welfare of students and staff in accordance with law.
And we changed that because I'm assuming any policy that we have, you're authorizing and encouraging me to enact. And
Yes,
it's probably
you
a
do.
bit more than encourages. And so we just thought that inherently, these are Board of Education policies. And we don't start every policy with the Board of Education authorizes and
No.
encourages. So we really thought that that could be
Yes.
truncated and just start with the superintendent's designee.
Right.
And that to us was a shall.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And part of with the civil authorities change to appropriate local agencies, that sort of ties into and is similar to the language that the new law with the EOP, the Emergency Operating Plan, where it says for districts should be working with the appropriate local agencies to come up with that plan. So we just wanted to bring it up to date with some similar language.
Okay.
Not many folks use civil authorities anymore.
Right.
As a,
Nope. Some language from the.
and it also got us the opportunity to put the word lockdown officially in that policy, which didn't exist in 1988.
All
The-
right.
the- I shouldn't jump ahead to you guys.
No. Questions on the policy itself? No? Mr. Francis?
Just on the admin procedure, I worked with Mr. Raymond, and obviously, you can see that what was there is completely gone.
Yes.
There is, what is in there is pretty much straight from the updated law.
Yeah.
So the numbers of drills, the types of drills, there's a little bit that is LPS with regard to we want something accomplished by such and such date, but most of this is pretty much from law.
Okay. Any comments on the administrative procedure portion? Okay, Mrs. Bonnefield, would you put EBBC on the agenda for a first read?
Got it, thank you.
And that wraps up policy. And again, thank you to our entire cabinet team for continuing to doggedly go through all of these policies and make sure that they are current, up-to-date, and relevant. It is, I know it's a daunting task, but it's sincerely appreciated.
Of course.
And that concludes policy, Mr. President Johnson.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. That'll take us to item 7, Legislative Committee. Mrs. Branford.
Okay, we have one item on the agenda, and it is the state budget update, and Mrs. O'Quist.
All right, so I shared with you briefly last week that, the governor had moved forward with a number of line item vetoes, and that we would monitor the developments of the legislature in relation to that. So the most current update is that various draft supplemental budget bills were introduced by both Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate to both undo some of the line item vetoes that Governor Whitmer made, as well as to implement some new spending priorities for the money that was freed up through that veto process. It's important to note, though, that really just begins the budget process all over again. Like many of the original budget bills that were introduced, these are simply a starting point for a new round of negotiations, and whether or not something specific is going to be included in the final legislation, this is really back at the starting gate. And so the governor did meet with legislative leadership last Thursday, and I believe is planning on meeting again tomorrow to continue to have dialogue about those changes and about those recommendations. And through Tri-County Alliance and through our other organizations, we are continuing to voice our priorities for reinvesting the remaining dollars according to the School Finance Research Collaborative, or as referred to SFRC, priorities specifically using the weighted formulas for special education, EL students, at-risk students, additional funding for literacy coaches, and so on. So that is where we are in the process. Again, we do have obviously a budget to work with, but then that supplemental budget takes a look at many of those items that were vetoed, that were
When
impacted.
it comes out, guys better get ready.
Whatever's fine.
Anytime is fine as long as we know when it is.
Yeah, anytime's fine, right? Then just let us know when.
So do you want her to start it as of next Monday?
Sure.
Yes, the 21st.
And then, or
Yeah.
would you like the weekend to be included, or?
No.
Because she could start it as a Friday?
Yeah, we get 2 weeks, started on a Monday.
On a Monday?
And then
Okay.
that gives us 2 weeks.
Sounds good. We'll start it on Monday, October 21st.
Can you ask her to add that to the calendar though?
Yes.
Please.
And whoever the first one is,
Tell us.
tell us.
Yeah, that would be a really good idea.
Got that, Karen?
Hey, it might not be me. You guys might get real excited about it. Might be Dan.
You know me.
Mrs. Wozniak is always on top of
I think
everything.
it's gonna be
She
Colleen.
has the
I
school
know.
law
It's been crazy
seminar
lately.
Of
on
course.
already on the calendar.
That's all I
Okay.
have. Thank you.
All right, I guess that ends legislative.
Thank you, Mrs. Bradford, and
You're welcome.
we'll go to item 8, Personnel Committee, Mrs. Frank.
We don't have anything.
You have nothing? All right, we are at the end of our agenda, and if there's nothing else, we are done. Thank you.
We are